Hey guys, tonight we dive into a world where your home doesn't just leak, it practically cries. We're talking about medieval peasant huts, those patchy little shelters history textbooks love to romanticize with words like humble and rustic. But trust me, if you walked into one during a thunderstorm, you'd think the roof was auditioning for a waterfall. It's a story soaked in mud, smoke, and a slow, soggy surrender to nature. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start here. Imagine standing outside your house and noticing your walls squish when you touch them. That's not a metaphor. In the early Middle Ages, especially between the 9th and 13th centuries, most rural homes weren't houses as much as they were biodegradable rain traps. Earth, straw, wood, a few stubborn prayers, that was your blueprint. And yes, you had neighbors, but don't expect neighborhood watch or HOA meetings. Expect puddles and the smell of wet livestock. Now let's set the scene properly. You're in a small English village around the year 1237. It's been raining since yesterday evening. That charming thatch roof above you. It's soaked through, you don't have shingles, tar, or even a proper gutter. What you do have is Ulrich, your next door neighbor, who swears that this particular patch of thatch is blessed by Saint Crispin. It's not the water trickles in, not from one leak, but 20. There's no ceiling, just bundled straw resting on wooden rafters. That straw was meant to repel water. Technically, in practice it acts more like a giant sponge suspended above your bed. And the walls are the walls, wattle and daub. Wattle being a lovely way to say woven sticks, and daub being clay, mud, straw, animal hair, and brace yourself, sometimes urine. Human and animal. Because nothing says home like ammonia-scented plaster. The floors, if you can call them that, are made of packed dirt. Sometimes people threw rushes or straw over it to soak up waste and water, but this was like trying to dry a lake with a napkin. When it rained, the earth sucked it all in, and your home became a marsh. You're ankle deep in muck, and yes, that squelch underfoot may have been alive at one point. One traveller in the 14th century described peasant homes as dens fit for beasts. And sure, that's rude, but also not wrong. And then there's the fire. In the center of the room you keep a pit going to cook and warm your frozen fingers. The smoke is supposed to drift out through a hole in the roof, but the rain's coming in through that same hole. So now the smoke clings low to the ceiling like a ghost that refuses to leave. Your eyes burn, your clothes are damp, and the bread you were toasting tastes like ash and despair. There's a specific type of damp that settles into your bones. Medieval peasants knew it well. It's not just the moisture, it's the hopelessness that comes with it. You fix one leak, another forms. You plug a hole with straw, the wind rips it loose. You try to sleep, but you're coughing. And something just dropped on your face from the rafters. Hopefully water. Probably not. Historians still argue whether peasants ever got used to this. Did they just tolerate living in a soft, leaking compost bin? Some say yes, it was life, and they adapted. Others suggest that chronic illness, exhaustion, and early death might have been the real price tag. And then there's your neighbor Ulrich again. He's standing outside, soaked, looking at his collapsing wall and muttering, "Should have used thicker daub." He's been saying that every winter for 15 years. Never thickened it. But he's an optimist. To be fair, these huts weren't meant to last centuries. They were often built quickly, with materials available within walking distance. No imported tiles or iron nails, just reeds, wood, mud, and the occasional bucket of cow dung. Some families rebuilt every decade. Others just patched endlessly, until the entire structure leaned like a tired old man who never quite lies down. But here's the real kicker. Many of these homes were built by the people who lived in them. There was no professional class of peasant architects. If your hut collapsed, it was on you, or your family, or maybe the village, if they liked you enough to help. Building was learned through repetition, not blueprints. Mistakes, common. Lessons, repeated. Dry nights? Rare. Still, there's something admirable about it. Right? The stubbornness. The constant hope that maybe this time, the roof won't leak. That maybe the fire will stay lit, the smoke will rise, and the floor won't drown your boots. It was miserable. Yes. But also weirdly human. You'd laugh at the absurdity if your teeth weren't chattering. Thatch, wattle, and the myth of cozy. Those three words belong on a medieval real estate ad, designed to trick the modern mind. Because when you hear wattle-and-daub cottage with thatched roof, you might imagine something storybook, quaint, warm, a bit like Bilbo Baggins might pop out with tea. But tonight let's gently unravel that fantasy, until it's lying in a soggy heap on the dirt floor where it belongs. Let's start with the thatch. Yes, the roof. The part that was supposed to keep things out. Thatch was made from bundles of straw or reeds, packed tightly together at an angle to repel water. On a dry, sunny day, this might have looked charming. Golden, even. But after 3 weeks of spring rain, the whole roof turned into a dripping sponge that resembled a wet haystack on the verge of spontaneous mildew. Now imagine lying beneath that with your eyes open, hearing the slow, rhythmic plip-plop of leaks. Not one, not two, but many. Because medieval thatch wasn't waterproof. It was water-resistant in theory, and only if laid thick and at the right angle, and regularly replaced. And regularly in this case meant by hand. On a ladder. In the wind. With last year's rotted straw falling in your face. So guess how often that happened. That's right. Rarely. Rarely. And then there's the myth that these homes were somehow cozy. That word didn't exist for peasants. Dry was the fantasy. Not smoking from all corners was luxury. Let's move to the walls, wattle and daub. A fancy name for woven sticks smeared with a slurry of mud, straw, hair, lime, and sometimes cow pee or pig dung. If it could bind, it was fair game. The texture. Think oatmeal mixed with sorrow. It hardened in dry weather into something sort of stable. But the moment thatched roofs leaked and water streamed down the walls, that daub rehydrated like a bad resurrection spell. It would flake. It would slump. It would fall off completely in clumps that splashed onto your bedmat or your stew. You didn't get mold. Mold got you. Oh, and rodents loved it. The crevices in the dried daub made perfect homes for mice and rats. The wattle behind it was like a highway for pests. It wasn't uncommon to hear rustling in the walls at night. Less ghost story, more rodent rave. And when the rain came, they'd sometimes join you inside. There's a man named Toba in one 12th century Welsh village, who became local legend not for his bravery in battle, but for the night he caught 3 rats in 1 cup. All escaping the collapsing daub behind his kitchen fire. They say he named them after saints. Not because he was pious, but because it made the experience feel less revolting. St. George, St. Cuthbert, and St. Reginald, he reportedly muttered, tossing them into the rain like sacrifices. Even when it wasn't raining, the inside of your home didn't dry out. With no insulation, no real seal between interior and exterior, and a fire that half worked and mostly smoked, your home stayed humid year-round. Everything, your cloak, your bed, your bread, carried that clingy, persistent dampness. Like the kind that wraps around your spine and never quite lets go. Historians still argue whether peasants ever found this normal. Did they adapt so thoroughly that they stopped noticing? Or did they just develop a tolerance to discomfort we can't fathom? What we do know. When archaeologists dig up peasant dwellings, they rarely find signs of repair beyond rough patches of daub. Meaning most people either lived with the disrepair, or simply couldn't fix it. And yet the myth persists. This idea that medieval huts were cute. It's probably the fault of museum reconstructions or historical dramas where the huts are spotless and everyone looks freshly shampooed. The truth. More likely, you'd walk into a peasant house and immediately walk back out apologizing to your lungs. Oh, and there was no furniture to warm the room. A table, maybe. A stool. Your bed might be a pile of straw or ferns with perhaps a sack of moss as a pillow. That's the context for the word cozy. And you know what's truly bleak? This was still better than being homeless. So the next time someone says they want to live in a simpler time, Ask them if they mean the kind of simple where their roof leaks like a colander. The walls bleed mud, and their mattress grows mushrooms if left alone too long. You probably won't survive this level of simple. Why roofs leaked more than gossip. Now there's a medieval truth no bard dared to rhyme about. Because if there was one thing guaranteed to betray you in the Middle Ages, it wasn't the king, the clergy, or even your neighbor stealing your goat. It was your roof. And it didn't need a reason. It simply waited for the first heavy drizzle, and then collapsed your trust, your sleep, and occasionally, your ceiling beam. See, thatched roofs are romanticized now as a kind of folksy hallmark of yesteryear. They pop up on travel brochures and pub signs, sitting smugly atop reconstructed cottages like crowns of wholesome nostalgia. But they weren't made for admiration, they were made because peasants had straw and no money. That's it. No one chose thatch. It was either that, or build your roof out of hopeful sighs and prayer. Thatching, when done well, can work. But let's be honest, peasants didn't have the time, tools or perfectly cut reeds to do it well. They grabbed what they had. Wheat straw from the last harvest, if it wasn't already molding. Sometimes marsh reeds. Occasionally they reused old thatch, because beggars couldn't be choosers, and builders were usually desperate cousins. And because most thatch wasn't treated or laid thick enough, it started to rot. Fast. One winter was all it took for a section of roof to become soft as bread pudding. And that's when the leaks began. Now imagine a leaky roof in a home, without buckets. Enter the catch method. Which basically meant sticking out every bowl, pot, ladle, broken jug, and even your child's wooden toy to catch dripping water. Families would strategically place them under known leaks. Some leaks were so regular they got names, like the one over the salt crock, or Ulrich's drip, named after a neighbor whose roof leaked in the exact same way, and swore it was just condensation. Here's a lesser known fact: in some villages, people actually fought over bundles of thatching straw, the way modern neighbors argue over parking spots. It was currency. And the quality of that straw varied wildly. If it was too short, it wouldn't overlap enough. If it was harvested too late, it broke easily. Some say a farmer named Dunstan once sold blessed thatch that was supposedly rainproof. He made a tidy profit, until a thunderstorm proved his miracle roof was more like a divine sieve. And when leaks formed, fixing them was theatrical. Climb up in the wind. Remove the rotting part. Hope the ladder doesn't sink into the mud. Hope your hands don't freeze. Hope the new straw stays in place. Hope the neighbors don't laugh when you fall into your own chicken coop. It was never a quiet job. Repairing a thatched roof often required two people, one to patch, and one to hand up bundles, and keep spirits unbroken. Now toss in this delightful complication. Pests. Birds loved thatch. Sparrows, starlings, jackdaws, little feathery saboteurs. They'd pluck pieces of your roof for nests, leaving behind tiny skylights and raining twigs. Rats, too, found it cozy. They'd burrow through the bundles and chew tunnels like it was a medieval amusement park. So when the rain came, and it always came, your roof was less protection and more participation. You weren't inside avoiding the weather, you were inside with it. And that's not even counting wind. Wind lifted thatch, peeled it back like banana skin. Blown thatch would flutter off into the sky, like some tragic kite made of broken dreams and spoiled wheat. In one recorded case from a storm in 1272, half the roofs in a village called Little Bourton were torn off entirely. The rest leaked or caught fire. Ah yes, fire. The mortal enemy of thatch. Because even if it was too soggy to burn 1 month, it could dry out dangerously fast the next. And once fire took hold, the roof went up like a torch. And not just your roof. Everyone's. Because cottages were often shoulder to shoulder. It was a neighborhood inferno, just waiting for one careless cooking fire or lightning bolt to say hello. Historians still debate whether peasants had designated fire watch systems. Some villages did, usually the richer ones. Others just prayed or shouted. There are old tales of people running door to door with buckets of well water, throwing it hopelessly onto flame-engulfed straw. But by the time they got to the roof, it was usually too late. The fire had already invited itself in. And here's the cruel punchline. A roof was often a family's biggest investment. It took time, labor, materials, and planning. Yet it was also the most vulnerable part of the entire structure. Every season degraded it, every storm threatened it, and when it failed, so did everything beneath it. Sleep, warmth, food, and morale. Still want that medieval Airbnb experience? You can almost picture a tired peasant mother trying to rock a baby to sleep while repositioning a bowl to catch a ceiling drip. "Don't worry, love," she whispers. "That leak's always been there. It's part of the family." And for most it was. The floor was just earth, literally. You didn't walk into your home so much as onto it. And while earth floor might sound grounded and rustic to the over-centered nose of the modern Airbnb adventurer, let's be absolutely clear. This wasn't a minimalist design choice. This was the default. A floor of dirt, dust and seasonal regrets. And in the rain, it turned into medieval soup. Here's the setup. No tiles, no planks, no stones, no sealant. Just the same dirt you stepped in outside. Lovingly tamped down by foot traffic, animal droppings, and the occasional chicken who wandered in uninvited. If your house didn't have actual livestock inside, it at least smelled like it did. There were no barriers between indoors and barnyard. They bled into each other like watercolor left in the rain. Now add moisture. After a good soaking from one of England's many lovable downpours, your floor would begin to soften, then bubble. Puddles formed. Not neat, clean puddles, mind you, but irregular swampy slicks of mud that would cling to your toes like a second skin. If you stepped in the wrong spot, your foot might sink with a squelch that said, "Welcome to despair." Some families scattered rushes or straw across the floor to soak up the wet and mask the smell. But this was like throwing tissues on a flood. Rushes, too, got damp. They rotted quickly, turned black, and sometimes grew their own little fungal cities. And there were no vacuum cleaners in medieval England. You didn't clean rushes, you replaced them. And when that took too much effort, you just layered new ones on top, like compost. So really the floor wasn't a surface. It was a sedimentary history of everyone who had lived, eaten, coughed, cried, bled or died in that house. There's a recorded complaint from a 14th century woman named Ethelwyn, who wrote, or dictated rather, to a local cleric, that her husband had slipped in the muck and bruised his backside upon the hearth. She followed this with, "I pray his injury gives him pause to improve it." There's no evidence he ever did. And here's another problem. Once that floor became wet, it stayed wet. No sun reached in to dry it. No fire was hot enough to bake the mud solid again. Not without smoking the household half to death. The moisture just lingered, forming the perfect breeding ground for bacteria, parasites, and the slow creeping chill of bone-deep dampness. Not just uncomfortable, dangerous. Children often got sick from sleeping too close to the ground. Coughs turned into fevers, fevers into funerals. Peasants didn't name every child at birth. They waited to see who made it past their first leak season. Let's not forget the bugs. Oh yes. With damp floors came insects. Centipedes, fleas, ticks and earthworms that wriggled into places no one asked them to be. Spiders made homes in the straw mats. Sometimes, if the house was particularly low and the land dipped near the foundation, water would flow in from the outside like a guest that didn't knock. Flooding wasn't dramatic. It was casual. A regular Tuesday event. Historians still argue over whether peasants tried to elevate sleeping areas to escape the muck. Some homes had slightly raised platforms, planks over stones, hay bales stacked in corners, but these were rare luxuries. Most people simply accepted their fate. Wake up wet, dry off by the fire, repeat until dead. There's even a whispered joke recorded in 13th century satire. If you love your child, don't put them to sleep, plant them. It wasn't funny then either. Now picture the family dog. Yes, they had dogs, mostly for protection or herding. The dog also slept on the floor, probably the driest corner, if it could find one. If it couldn't, it curled up with you. And if it shook itself dry at night, congratulations. You've just been baptized by the blessed rain of canine disapproval. Modern archaeologists have found soil from peasant homes layered with ash, food scraps, bone fragments, lice casings, and all the precious artifacts of survival. It tells a story not of filth, but of endurance.
The floor wasn't clean, but it held the memory of every moment lived atop it. So the next time you step onto a cold bathroom tile and shiver, remember that medieval peasant you're romanticizing had never experienced a dry foot after October, and their floor didn't shiver. It squelched. The plague of the timber frame wasn't a sudden catastrophe like the name implies. It was a slow-motion betrayal that started with hope and ended with something chewing through your kitchen wall. Because when your house was made of wood and the rain refused to stop, nature didn't knock politely. It leaked in, wormed in, grew in, and one day, that proud little timber frame just sighed and gave out. So let's talk about the backbone of your humble medieval hut, the timber frame. At first glance, this sounds strong. Wooden beams, solid, robust, but it wasn't exactly a Viking hall. These were raw logs or rough-hewn planks, often from nearby forests, felled without much seasoning or curing. In other words, they were still a little too alive. See, fresh wood contains moisture. If you don't let it dry before building with it, it warps, it twists, it invites fungi in like an open-door feast. And back then, no one had climate-controlled sheds for curing timber. You chopped it, you hoisted it, and you hoped the spirits of the forest would look the other way. Spoiler, they didn't. The first thing that happened, warping. Your straight beams began to bow. That might not sound like a big deal, but imagine your wall slowly becoming a crescent moon. Doors didn't shut, roofs sagged, floors tilted until your soup slid off the table. Next came the insects. Termites weren't the only culprits. Wood-boring beetles, weevils, and even wasps loved to burrow into timber, especially when it was damp. The holes they left behind weren't just ugly, they were structural sabotage. Over time, the beams became hollowed-out husks of their former selves, groaning under the weight of the soggy roof above. There's a story from East Anglia about a peasant named Bricktrick who once leaned against his doorframe after a storm and promptly fell through it. The entire wall collapsed in a gentle, almost elegant slide, as if the house was simply giving up. Bricktrick broke 2 ribs. The door, completely unharmed, still hanging in midair, like a cruel joke. And then there was mildew. Mildew isn't glamorous, but it thrives in moist timber. You'd find it blooming in the corners, like secret gardens of doom. Dark stains spreading across beams, oozing a musty smell that clung to your clothes and food. It crept from plank to plank, like it had a grudge, and once it took hold, it was nearly impossible to evict. Did people try? Of course they did. They scrubbed with vinegar or soot. They painted over it with lime wash. They whispered prayers to Saint Nicholas, patron of wooden structures. Not really, but they might as well have. Nothing worked for long, because the rain always came back, and the beams always softened. Eventually, entire households smelled like the inside of a forgotten root cellar. Historians still debate just how bad the rot was. Some argue that regular maintenance helped. Others say peasants lacked the time, tools or energy to do anything more than shrug and prop up a leaning wall with a broomstick. The evidence in surviving village ruins, a mix of collapsed structures, patched together and beams so bug-eaten they look like lace. And the worst part, timber was expensive. Not everyone had access to it. Some peasants had to use half-rotten wood from older buildings, or even driftwood if they lived near water. That means they were rebuilding homes, with materials already halfway to being rotch. It was the architectural equivalent of reusing old bread to make a table. You might think stone was a better option. It was, if you could afford it. Stone walls held up against rain, but they were cold, hard, and often left unsealed. And unless you had masons in the family, you weren't building with it. So for most people, it was timber, or nothing. Even the best case scenario, a well-built timber frame with dry beams, only delayed the inevitable. Rain would find the gaps, the joints would swell and split, the frame would creak like a ship in a storm, even on calm nights. And one day, the central beam, your last hope, would let out a slow, aching crack, then silence, then the crash. There's something poetic about it. If you tilt your head sideways and squint through the mold, a house, trying its best, held together by mud, wood, prayers and rope, battling the elements every single day, losing and still standing anyway. For a while, daub like you mean it. Because if you didn't, your walls would fall off. Literally. Wattle and daub was the medieval version of DIY home building. Except instead of paint and plaster, you were smearing mud and manure on a fence of twigs, and hoping nobody sneezed too hard near it. And if it rained, well, that's when you learned what kind of person you really were. The wattle park was a kind of basket weave of thin bendable sticks. Hazel, willow, anything pliable enough to be bent without snapping. These sticks were woven between upright wooden posts, kind of like medieval rebar. It was clever, flexible, cheap, and about as strong as a polite suggestion. Enter the daub. This was your filler, the paste you slathered onto the sticks to seal the wool, and give it, well, woolness. The mixture varied from village to village, but the usual recipe was some combination of mud, straw, horsehair, lime, ash, and the year, cow, pig, human, whatever was on hand. Why? Because the uric acid acted like a primitive hardening agent, a bonding miracle, a medieval adhesive. Also, no one was wasting clean water on walls. So there you were, standing in the rain, smearing warm, wet, stinking daub onto your house, like it owed you money. And here's where it gets really heartwarming. Applying daub was often a communal event. Whole families, sometimes even whole hamlets, would gather for daubing days. It was less of a party, and more of a shared mud bath, with architectural consequences. Children would stomp the mixture with their feet to blend it. Adults would sling it onto walls in thick globs. It was messy. It was exhausting. It got everywhere, and you needed layer after layer. Now, when dry, daub could be surprisingly durable. It insulated well enough, kept out drafts, was even mildly fire resistant. But this depended on two key things: sun and time, dry weather, and plenty of it. Which is exactly why rain was the daub's mortal enemy. If applied too soon before a storm, it would slide off the wall in streaks of sopping defeat. If a finished daub wall wasn't protected by decent thatch, the rain would pelt it, soften it, and eventually wash parts of it away. Walls began to blister, then bubble, then peel. You'd come outside and find clumps of your house slowly returning to the earth, like some kind of medieval mud monster shedding its skin. And the rain didn't even need to be direct. High humidity alone could ruin a daub wall. The straw inside would absorb water and begin to rot. Hair fibers snapped. The mix would crack, flake. Sometimes it crumbled if you leaned too hard. There's an account from a Flemish monk in 1221 who wrote, "The peasant house I was welcome to dissolved upon the morning dew, and the wall where I'd leaned left straw in my robes." You can almost hear the judgment in that sentence. But to the peasant, that was Tuesday. Also worth noting, daub wasn't immune to critters. Insects burrowed into it, mice chewed it, birds pecked at it for nesting, and the local children, oh, they loved pulling it apart. There's even archaeological evidence of little fingerprints in lower sections of daub walls, tiny mischief makers caught red-handed. Centuries later, historians still argue about just how long daub walls lasted. Some say 5 to 10 years before a full reapplication. Others suggest minor patchwork was constant, like dental fillings for your house. It was never done. You were always rebuilding, always replacing bits that fell off, chipped away, or were eaten by goats. Yes, goats. They chewed on daub, probably out of boredom or revenge. Now let's say it's harvest season. You're exhausted. Your hands are calloused, and your roof is leaking so badly that the interior walls are turning back into puddles. You need to redaub, but guess what? You're out of straw, and your cow, bless her, isn't producing much urine lately. You're stuck. Your house is literally flaking apart, and the sky is laughing at you. Still feel like moving into a wattle-and-daub fantasy home. One local legend tells of a widow named Magda, who redaubed her entire hut in one day after a hailstorm stripped the front wall clean. She used clay from the nearby stream, mixed with pig hair and soot from the hearth. It held for a while. People came to visit just to touch her wall and wonder how she pulled it off. Magda never told them her secret, but we suspect it was pure spite. That's the real beauty of daub. It wasn't high art. It wasn't precise, but it was yours. You made it with your hands, your waste, your land, and if it rained, and the walls wept. You didn't curse the heavens, you cursed the gate. Then you picked up the mop, mashed it again, and smeared it back on like a defiant middle finger to the weather.
Pea is a building material. Sure, why not? In a time where the concept of hygiene was mostly theoretical and sanitation involved throwing things out the window, literally, medieval peasants looked at bodily fluids and thought, useful. And in this particular case, human and animal urine wasn't just tolerated, it was a prized ingredient in your home's very skeleton. We already talked about daub, that sticky, pasty blend of mud, straw and assorted organic matter that held together the walls of your house like gluey papier-mâché. But the part that most people gag at fair is the addition of urine. Yes, they peed in it, on purpose. Here's the science. Well, the folk science, urine contains urea, which breaks down into ammonia. Ammonia has basic pH and antimicrobial properties, which made it a primitive hardener and mold deterrent in some construction techniques. When mixed into daub, it helped bind the particles together, especially if lime was also used. It also supposedly slowed down rot. Historians still argue about how effective this really was, but clearly it made enough of a difference that people kept doing it. Now imagine this, you're collecting materials to patch your home's crumbling back wall. You need mud, straw, maybe some animal hair, and right, you need a fresh supply of yellow water. The solution, chamber pots, or the barn, or the corner behind the tool shed that everyone pretended wasn't for that purpose, but absolutely was. Some families saved their urine in buckets. Yes, buckets. Sometimes labelled, sometimes not. Guests were rarely offered a seat near them. These were kept warm by the hearth or sealed in clay jars. And if you're wondering if the smell was overpowering, yes, absolutely. But in a house that already smelled like wet goat, unwashed feet, and smoky cabbage stew, what's one more layer? It's worth noting that this wasn't unique to peasants. Even in city tanneries and dye houses, urine was a common industrial fluid. It was used to clean cloth, tan hides, and even as a cleaning agent for laundry. There's documentation of people being paid for their urine. So the fact that it made its way into peasant homes isn't just gross, it's on brand. Let's meet someone who truly understood the power of pee. Her name was Freydis, a widow living in the outskirts of York around 1190. Known in her hamlet for the strongest walls and the sharpest tongue, Freydis swore by her secret daub recipe: ash, crushed eggshells, pig bristles and fermented cow urine. She claimed it kept her house warmer, tighter and drier than anyone else's on the lane. Her neighbours mocked her, until a spring flood melted their back walls and hers stayed standing. After that, Freydis brew became local legend. Now before you start imagining vats of sloshing pee being stirred with wooden paddles, okay fine, you're already imagining it. Know that the process wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't exact. There were no measurements, no ratios, no testing strips. You learned through repetition and result. If your wall cracked too fast, maybe next time use more straw. If it smelled less like rot, maybe thank the cow. But even with its questionable chemistry, this method had limits. Urine-laced daub could resist minor moisture, maybe a drizzle, a good dew. But sustained rain? Nah. It might slow the process of decay, but it didn't prevent it. The ammonia might repel some insects, but not enough to turn your wall into a fortress. And certainly not enough to keep the mold at bay if your thatch gave out. Historians still debate whether the ammonia content had any long-term benefit for health. Some argue it helped disinfect surfaces, others say it created more respiratory issues from the combined smell and fumes. There are even recorded cases of peasants mixing in dried dung alongside urine, which makes one wonder how anyone made it past their 30s with working lungs. And yet in a world with no hardware stores, no sealants, no engineered polymers, this was what you had. You worked with the land, with your animals, with your body. Everything you produced, everything could be turned into material. Waste wasn't waste, it was potential. And yes, that meant even your own pee could become the glue that held your world together. Today, we flinch at the idea. We scrub, we sanitize, we spritz lavender mist. But back then you didn't flinch. You adapted. You saw rain coming and thought, time to grab the bucket. Not to bail the water, at least not yet, but to mix the next batch of hope and pea plaster that might keep your home standing just a little longer. Rain, rats and rotten luck, three things you could count on in medieval life, often arriving together like an unholy trinity. When it rained, rats moved in. When rats moved in, your food disappeared. And when your food disappeared, your luck ran out faster than your patience with that eternally dripping ceiling. This wasn't just uncomfortable, it was survival under siege. Let's start with the rain, the great equalizer. It didn't care if you were a noble or a shepherd, it fell everywhere, crept into everything. But if you were a peasant, it hit different. It hit inside. With roofs that leaked, walls that crumbled, and floors that puddled, the average peasant home during the rainy season became a soggy, dripping mess of mold, mud and misery. And rainwater wasn't just water, it was transportation. It carried in spores, rot and worst of all, vermin. Rats adored the wet. When fields flooded and burrows drowned, they did what any smart rodent would do. They moved uphill, into houses, into your house. Through cracks in the daub, up the sides of the timber, across the beams overhead. Sometimes you'd hear the pitter-patter of tiny feet on your thatch at night. Sometimes you'd see two beady eyes watching from a corner while you tried to eat your watery stew. Medieval homes were rat paradises, warm if smoky, full of hiding places, full of crumbs, and most importantly, full of people, which meant waste. Unwashed bodies, dropped food, stored grain, soiled straw. To a rat, that was a buffet. To a peasant, it was Tuesday. There's a tale passed down in a village near Worcester about a man named Osmond, who once caught a rat chewing on his sandal while it was still on his foot. Did he scream? Probably. But more importantly, he kept the rat afterward as a warning, mounted it on a stick, stuck it in the doorway, called it Sir Choose-a-lot. It didn't work. The rats came anyway. They always did. And when it rained, the smell changed. The air inside your home turned thick, humid and sour. Everything reeked: wet straw, damp wood, mildew-soaked clothing, and the sharp, unmistakable scent of something dead behind the firewood stack. You learned not to ask. This is where rotten luck came in, because if a rat didn't eat your food, mold probably did. Or the rain soaked your grain sacks until they slumped into the floor like defeated soldiers. You couldn't just run to the pantry and get more. That was your year's supply. If it molded, you either scraped off the top and pretended it was fine, or you starved. And if your roof failed during a heavy storm, and they often did, it wasn't just uncomfortable, it could mean death. Let's not forget the illnesses. Rats weren't just annoying roommates. They carried fleas, and fleas carried disease. Bubonic plague didn't come from nowhere. It thrived in the overlap of filth, rodents and waterlogged despair. While the Black Death wouldn't explode across Europe until the mid-1300s, its ingredients were already in place. Peasant homes were ticking biological time bombs. Historians still argue how aware people were of this danger. Some say peasants associated illness with sin or spirits, not sanitation. Others suggest that, deep down they knew. Why else would they burn rushes, light pungent herbs, hang bunches of garlic or rue near entryways? Maybe they didn't know why it worked, but they knew when something stank, something bad followed, and still, they stayed. Because what choice did they have? Leave the house and what, live under a tree? The home may have been leaky, rat-filled and always damp, but it was shelter. It was better than nothing. Barely, but it was. Even more tragically, many of these people built their homes, with their own hands, with their own family. Imagine raising a wall 1 month and watching it sag the next. Hearing rats scurry through the timber you carved yourself. Waking up to find your child's blanket soaked through from a drip you patched yesterday. And still you start again. That's what's so heartbreakingly human about it. This endless defiance. You knew the rain would come. You knew the rats would follow. You knew your wall might fall in next week. And still you repaired, rebuilt, resmeared the daub, replastered with pig hair and hope, lit a smoky fire, stirred your gruel, and kissed your child goodnight, as if everything was fine, even when your boots squelched at the door. So no, they didn't survive, in spite of the rain. They survived with it. shoulder to shoulder with mold, with rodents, with the ever-dripping sorrow of a home that never quite dried out. Chimneys, too fancy. Enjoy the smoke. That was the default medieval heating plan. And by heating plan I mean set something on fire in the middle of the room and hope for the best. There was no flue, no vent, no tidy stone fireplace, just a smoky sputtering hearth pit right on the floor, or in slightly fancier cases, in a crude clay basin. The smoke, it hung out with you, like an uninvited guest who overstayed every night and coughed in your face while you slept. Let's paint the picture. You've got a single-room hut, roughly the size of a modern garage, walls made of wattle and daub, roof made of thatch, floor made of dirt and sorrow. In the center of it all, your fire. It was the heart of the home, your only source of warmth, your cooking station, your light after sunset. But it was also your indoor pollution machine. Without a chimney, smoke had only one place to go up, if it was lucky, but usually, it pooled and billowed, trapped beneath the low ceiling, weaving between the beams and settling just above head height. If you were tall, you spent your life blinking through tears. If you were short, you still breathed in enough soot to coat your lungs like the inside of a bread oven. Some houses had a tiny hole in the roof, a smoke louve meant to let it out, in theory, but this hole also let in rain, birds, bugs, and the occasional judgmental glance from your neighbor's rooster. And if your thatch was already leaky, which it was, then adding an intentional hole just felt like handing the storm a bigger invitation. So most families made do. You learned to live with smoke, to cook quickly, to sit low, to wipe soot off everything. Eyes constantly stung. Infants coughed themselves to sleep. Old men hacked up black phlegm and claimed it was just the weather. There are even medieval health tracts that describe the chimney cough, a dry, rattling sound common in homes without proper venting. It wasn't a diagnosis, it was a lifestyle. And yet the fire was essential. It dried your soaked shoes, boiled your cabbage stew, lit your room when the sky was a rain cloud of doom. You couldn't just not use it. The smoke was the price of survival. And even then, it came with risks. Because remember, thatch burns. One stray ember, one puff of wind through the wall, and the roof went up in flames faster than a peasant could shout, "Get the goat." Fires were common. Whole rows of cottages would vanish in a single gust-fed blaze. Some villages even had fire watchers, usually an elder with a bell and a wooden pail, whose job was to stay awake and shout warnings. These were the unsung heroes of the leaky era. There's a story from a hill village in Devon, about a girl named Edda, who once tried to cook during a windstorm. The smoke wouldn't rise, it just swirled angrily, filling the room. She opened the door for fresh air, and a gust of wind whipped into the hearth, sending flaming kindling across the floor. The only reason her home didn't burn down was because it was soaked. Yes, the leaks saved her. She called it divine irony. Her neighbors called it dumb luck. Historians still argue about how common true chimneys were before the 14th century. Some wealthier households had them, especially in stone homes or manors. But for peasants, they were a pipe dream, literally. A vertical shaft made of brick or stone was expensive, complex, and unnecessary in the eyes of local landlords. As long as the peasants were warm enough to work, their lungs didn't factor into the budget, and so they suffered, quietly, year after year, teaching their children how to hold their breath when stirring porridge, placing sleeping mats in the corners furthest from the hearth, propping open doorways, even in winter, just to let the air cycle, because a freezing draft was preferable to choking on your dinner smoke. Modern reconstructions of peasant homes often get this part wrong. They show clean hearths with soft candlelight and breathable space. In reality, you couldn't see half the room. The air shimmered with haze, shadows danced through soot. If someone walked in, you might not know who it was until they coughed, and you always coughed. So next time you're sitting by your cozy fireplace, sipping spiced tea, watching the flames flicker gently behind tempered glass, remember the peasant, crouched by a half-lit fire, eyes red, hair singed, nose running from the smoke, still grateful, because if there was fire, there was heat. If there was heat, there was life, even if it stung a little. Why they built low, and regretted it, that's a question for the ages, or at least for any poor soul who ever tried to stand up too fast inside a peasant hut and cracked their skull against a sagging ceiling. Because here's the uncomfortable truth,
Medieval peasants didn't build low because they wanted to. They built low because they had to. And every time it rained, they were reminded of why that choice was both practical and a disaster waiting to happen. Let's unpack this. Medieval peasant homes were squat, short, claustrophobic. The average peasant could touch the ceiling without stretching. Some couldn't even stand upright inside their own house. Beams hung low, thatch pressed down from above, and the whole structure seemed to hunker like it was afraid of being noticed by God. Why so low? Well, first, materials. Timber wasn't cheap. Big straight beams for tall houses were rare and expensive. Most peasants built with what they could drag from the nearest forest: crooked branches, small trunks, scavenged logs. If the wood wasn't long enough, the house wasn't going to be tall enough. Second, labor. Taller buildings meant more weight, more balance, and more risk. Low houses required less scaffolding, fewer support braces, and were easier to thatch. That was important when your construction crew was 3 neighbors, a goat, and your cousin who once saw someone build a fence. Third, wind. Low buildings stood a better chance against gales, especially in open fields and moorland villages, where the breeze had nothing to slow it down. A taller house caught more wind, and if your walls were made of sticks and old mud pies, that was bad news. So they built low, and close, and tight. But oh, did they regret it when the rains came, because a low ceiling meant less air, and when the fire smoked, the smoke hung thick around your head like an angry spirit. You coughed, you squinted, you waved your hand pointlessly in front of your face, but the smoke didn't leave, it just swirled above you, indifferent to your suffering. A low roof also meant less slope, and in thatch roof science, slope equals survival. A steep thatch roof sheds water, a shallow one holds onto it like a grudge. Rain pooled in the thatch, it soaked in, dripped through, and found its way down to the beam. Then it crept to the walls, then it crept to your shoulders, and then one night, while you were dreaming of bread that didn't taste like ash, a piece of wet thatch would slap the ground like a soggy curtain. There's a report from a 13th century tax ledger referencing one hut wherein the roof slipped inward upon the tenant during Lent. No details, just that the man survived, and that he owed the reeve 6 hens and a new roof. Low ceilings also trapped humidity, the same moisture that clung to your walls, your hair, your bed. It stayed inside. It never rose. It hovered. It curled into your blankets and made everything smell like mushrooms and wet wool. You couldn't dry anything. Your boots stayed damp. Your socks. Hilarious. Your bread. Don't even talk about it. And then there was the psychology of it. Living in a space where you couldn't stretch, couldn't stand, couldn't breathe clean air. That wears on a person. You slouch. You move carefully. You get used to stooping inside your own home like a guest in someone else's space. It's subtle, but it shapes your mind, makes you smaller. Even the animals noticed. Chickens roosted in the rafters and never left. Cats climbed the thatch from the outside and fell in. One Welsh folk tale tells of a man who woke up with a sheep staring down at him from the ceiling beam, having somehow jumped through a gap in the roof during a storm. Did he panic? No. He just rolled over and muttered, "Not again." Historians still debate whether low ceilings were always a necessity. Some claim certain regions could afford higher builds with longer beams and better slopes, but for the average villager, the low ceiling was the default, and the regrets were seasonal. Because in the summer, the heat cooked you like a turnip in a clay pot. In the winter, the smoke froze in the rafters and rained down soot. And in the rainy months, let's be honest, all the months, you didn't even try to stay dry. You just tried to stay conscious. So why didn't they raise them? Because raising a roof isn't easy. It requires new timbers, new thatch, new angles, and a new understanding of balance. Most peasants didn't have time to reimagine architecture. They were too busy chasing goats, avoiding illness, and replacing the daub that fell off every other Tuesday. And yet somehow, they made it work. They slept curled, sat low, laughed under beams they couldn't walk under, learned where to duck, warned guests with the phrase, "Mind your skull," like it was just a quirky feature of life. That's resilience. Miserable, muddy resilience. The leak becomes a pond, not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. In a medieval peasant hut, rain didn't just drip politely in the corner like an apologetic guest. It accumulated, spread, soaked, and eventually settled into full-bodied puddles you could name. And by the time it reached your ankles, the question wasn't, how do we fix the leak, but how deep is it this time? Let's start with the obvious. The floor, dirt, as we've established, doesn't drain. It absorbs, slowly, unevenly, and when it hits its limit, it just sits there damp, heavy, sullen, and the house, already slightly sunken from years of trodden feet and collapsing wall, offered no slope for water to escape. It stayed right in the middle, or worse, in your sleeping area, and then it spread. Peasants didn't have floorboards to elevate them, no drainage trenches, no corner sump, with a charming little pump handle. What they had was rush matting, often mouldy, or layered straw, also mold, and these acted like giant sponges, soaking up water until they couldn't anymore, at which point they just floated. You've never known defeat till you've seen your cooking stool drift gently away from you while you're trying to light a fire. Some families tried clever tricks, dig shallow grooves in the floor to guide water away, place flat stones to stand on, elevate sleeping pallets on rocks or logs, use broken pots to divert runoff into corners, but none of it lasted, because when the rain really came, night-long, week-long rains, it didn't care about your efforts. The hut became a marsh. Your walls sweat, your bedding wept, and the middle of your home, it was a reflecting pool. One traveller once described stepping into a rural cottage, wherein the floor was soft and shivering like a frog bog. That's not a poetic exaggeration, that's trauma. Now let's add livestock. Many peasant homes shared space with animals, especially in winter. Goats, chickens, even pigs might be brought indoors for warmth, and guess what? They didn't mind the puddles. In fact, they made them worse. Urine, dung, spilled water, all of it added to the swampy cocktail beneath. By spring, some homes weren't just damp, they were ecosystems. Children played in it. They didn't know better. Toddlers would crawl through the mud between table legs, tracking slush up sleeping mats and licking their fingers before anyone could stop them. Sickness spread this way. Parasites too. You could boil your water, sure, but you couldn't boil your floor. There's a recorded case from a Norfolk Manors court roll. A complaint about a tenant who let his roof fall such that all within was drowned, and his son took chill and perished. That's the dry language of history trying to suppress something devastating. His son died, likely from pneumonia, or from an infection caused by cold, wet living, because the house became a pond, and no one could do anything about it. Some tried to escape the puddle problem by laying planks, if they had access to spare wood, which was rare. Others put barrels in the middle of the room to catch the major leaks and at least contain the splash zone. But this led to comical and tragic accidents. One wrong step at night, and you tripped into a full rain barrel in the dark, knocked it over, drenched everything again. Back to square one. Historians still argue over whether this level of flooding was constant or seasonal. Some say only the worst huts suffered year-round ponding. Others suggest it was widespread, especially in low-lying regions, or during particularly wet decades. What they agree on is that the average peasant wasn't dry, not fully, not for long. Even in moments of good weather, the aftermath lingered. Wet floors turned to cracked floors when they dried too fast. Flies gathered, the air stayed humid, and the straw you thought you salvaged from the flood, it fermented in your sleep. There's a bitter sort of humour that peasants developed to cope. One joke from a 14th century alehouse says, "I tried to mop the floor, but feared I'd clean it into a hole." Another, "My boots caught fish this morning." These weren't just jokes. They were confessions of helplessness, of endurance, of living in a place where the outside never stayed out. Because when your roof leaks and your walls whoop, the floor doesn't stand a chance. The pond becomes permanent. You learn to sidestep it, to sleep beside it, to dream of warmth, and wake to the cold kiss of standing water lapping at your ankles like a pet. And still, you light the fire, you patch the roof, you tell your children not to splash, and you keep living. Because what else can you keep living? Because what else can mold as a roommate? That's not a metaphor. That's not a fun. And it's not a funny. In a medieval peasant house, mold wasn't something you occasionally spotted on forgotten bread. It was a full-time rent-free squatter living in your walls, bedding, clothes, and sometimes your lungs. It didn't just visit after a storm. It stayed, it settled, it thrived, and no one asked it to. Here's the truth. When you live in a house that leaks from the top, seeps from the bottom, and breathes like a damp sponge, mold becomes inevitable. And not just the green fuzzy kind we see on leftovers. We're talking black spots blooming along the winter, white dust creeping over thatched edges, rust-colored streaks rising up the daub like smoke. It was diverse, it was aggressive, and it was everywhere. Let's look at the culprits. Thatched roofs absorbed water like enthusiastic towels, then slowly released it indoors as a fine mist or steady drip. The wattle-and-daub walls, once soaked, never truly dry. And the straw on the floor? Well, once that got wet, it became a buffet for spores. Mix all that with poor air circulation, no chimney, tiny windows, if any, and the humidity stayed locked inside. You didn't have a living space. You had a greenhouse for mold. And peasants knew it. They might not have known the science, but they knew that smell. Musty, sour, throat scratchy, the smell of sickness, the smell of damp cloth and sour meat and rot hiding just out of sight. Enter respiratory illness, constant coughing, phlegm that changed colour with the seasons, wheezing so normal that no one even commented on it. They just chalked it up to bad air or a chill. Children slept low to the ground, closest to the spores. Infants often didn't wake up. People died from what we'd now call pneumonia or chronic bronchitis, but back then it was just the damp curse. Let me introduce you to a man named Gifric. He lived near a marsh in eastern Mercia and became something of a legend, not for surviving a battle or farming record crops, but for growing mushrooms indoors. On his walls, the neighbours joked that he had a third harvest, and he didn't even deny it. He pointed to one patch of the daub, pulled off a handful of bays fuzz, and muttered, "Smells better than the stew." This was the kind of humour peasants used to stay sane, because they couldn't fight the mold. There was no bleach, no dehumidifier, no sunlight strong enough to reach inside and chase it away. They could scrape at it with sticks. They could burn aromatic herbs, sage, juniper, even dried dung to cover the scent. But it always came back. And then there were the clothes. If you ever left your cloak too close to a damp wall, or God forbid, on the dirt floor overnight, it would bloom by morning. You'd shake it out, slap the spores loose, and put it on anyway. Because it was cold. Because you had one cloak, not five. And mold or no mold, it was better than nothing. Historians still debate just how much this mold affected medieval health. Some say the impact was overblown, that the real killers were malnutrition and infection. Others point to accounts of villagers with chronic breathing problems, bleeding gums, even strange neurological symptoms, and ask what else could it have been. We'll never know, but the pattern is clear. Mold didn't just exist, it dominated. Some homes were worse than others. Low-lying areas near streams or marshes suffered most. So did homes built too close together, where airflow was restricted. One monastic scribe described visiting a peasant's cottage and stepping inside, as if into a damp tomb, the walls running with tears and the air thick as spoiled milk. He didn't stay for supper, but even in drier seasons, even in well-kept huts, mold lurked, hidden behind the daub, nestled in the thatch, waiting, because as soon as the rain returned, and it always returned, the spores woke up, they stretched, they spread, and your house turned once again into a living, breathing mushroom farm. And what did peasants do? They endured. They kept sweeping, kept cooking, kept sleeping beside walls that coughed with spores and whispered disease. Some villagers tried hanging herbs or painting lime wash on walls to deter the worst of it. Others simply accepted it, named it, laughed about it in the tavern. One popular toast went, "To dry beds and walls that do not flower." Funny, yes, but only because crying was less useful. You didn't choose to live with mold, but you learned to live despite it. You folded your blankets every morning to shake out the damp. You moved your sleeping mat from spot to find the driest patch. You coughed, and you drank more broth, and you prayed to Saint Blaise, patron of throats, hoping that this winter would spare you, because you could patch a roof, you could rebuild a wall, but mold was forever.
Meet Alric, king of bucket duty. You've already met his kind, quiet, hunched, sleeves always damp, the man everyone nods at during a storm because he's already carrying 3 pails and a hollowed gourd. Force, every village had one. Alric wasn't his real name everywhere, of course, but every village had an Alric, the bucket warrior. the leak sentinel, the one who knew exactly where the roof would betray you next. Let's paint the scene. It's the middle of the night. The storm outside sounds like someone hurling gravel at your house while a giant weeps on the roof. Inside, your wife is snoring. The fire is sputtering, and Ulrich is already up. Again, because drip, drip, drip has started over the sleeping baby's head. He doesn't curse, he doesn't panic. He moves like a man who's done this his entire life. He slides the bucket under the leak, tilts it with a stone, catches the drip perfectly. Then he steps over the dog, sidesteps the creaky floorboard, and scans the beams for the next betrayal. Ulrich had a system: wooden bowl for the quiet leak, iron pot for the fast drip, the old grain jar for the splashy one that kept him up, and when he ran out of containers, he used shoes, or cupped his hands, or, on one memorable night, his own hat. His family didn't even wake up anymore when the leaks started. They trusted him. And they also knew if the roof was leaking and the buckets weren't out, Ulrich was dead. Let's talk buckets. They weren't the factory-cut, metal-handled hardware store specials we know. These were rough-hewn wooden affairs often made from bound staves and sealed with pitch, if you were lucky. If not, you used clay pots or wide wooden bowls or old jugs with their necks knocked off. Some were cracked. All smelled faintly of sour milk and mushrooms, but they worked. Kind of. Ulrich's collection lined the back wall like loyal soldiers. Each had its purpose. Each had its place. And during heavy rains he'd rotate them like a medieval barista tending percolators. When one filled up, he'd toss it outside and replace it. Sometimes he didn't even empty them, just chucked the water through the open door into the dark and prayed it didn't splash back in. There's a tale passed around in the Midlands about an Ulrich who once caught 27 leaks in a single night, using everything from buckets to cabbage leaves. They say he didn't sleep a wink. The next morning his wife asked if the house had stayed dry. He looked her dead in the eye and said, "Mostly, hero." But bucket duty wasn't just about catching leaks. It was about knowing your roof, where the rafters dipped, where last year's patch was starting to peel, where the thatch had thinned from sparrow theft or general decay. Ulrich was a roof whisperer, a soggy prophet. He could hear the storm approaching and know whether it was a 2-bucket night or a full cavalry deployment. Historians still debate how many medieval homes had permanent roof maintenance plans. Spoiler, they didn't. They had Ulrich, or someone like him. Someone who stayed up while others slept. Who listened to the rain not with fear, but with calculation. And maybe, just maybe, a tiny flicker of pride. Because let's not pretend this job wasn't thankless. The next morning, the family might complain. "My bed's wet. My cloak smells like pond. The stew's watery." And there would be Ulrich, exhausted, covered in soot and roof bits, looking like he crawled out of a bog, silently pointing to the buckets. "You're welcome." And of course there were always the leaks he missed. The surprise drip. The splatter that woke you with cold water in your ear. No matter how good he was, the rain always found a new way in. But still, Ulrich tried. Every time. Because in a house where no one else knew what to do, someone had to. Was he a hero? Not exactly. He was just tired, constantly tired, and a little damp, and occasionally shouted at by the dog when he knocked over the wrong bowl. But if your home didn't fully flood that night, if your child stayed dry, if your soup didn't drown, if you got even 3 hours of solid sleep, you had Ulrich to thank. And so here's to him. The man with the bucket, the guardian of the thatch, the peasant who fought the storm with nothing but a pot, a prayer, and enough stubbornness to challenge the clouds themselves. If you wanted a window too bad. In a medieval peasant house, windows weren't a design element. They were a liability, a risk, a hole that let in rain, wind, rats, gossip, and worst of all, cold. So what did peasants do instead of installing bright, cheerful openings to gaze dreamily out of while sipping mead? They didn't. Or they covered them. Or they made them so small and crooked they were more suggestion than architecture. Let's begin with what we modern folk expect. Glass. That's adorable. Glass was expensive, fragile and rare. If it existed in a village, it was in the church or the manor house, not in your mud and stick shack. Peasants didn't just not have glass. They didn't imagine having glass. It would have been like hoping for a dragon to build you a chimney. So if a house had an opening, it was usually a small rectangular gap near the roofline, maybe just big enough for a mouse with ambition. These were called loopholes or air slits. Some didn't even open fully. Others were covered with oiled cloth, animal bladder, or waxed parchment to block the wind and light. Yes, bladder. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was cheap, translucent and available, assuming your livestock was recently dead and you were quick with a knife. The result, filtered, yellowish light that made everything inside look like a fever dream. Shadows moved. Corners flickered. You couldn't really see. You just sensed things. The goat. Your grandmother. A pile of damp laundry plotting against you. And of course these coverings weren't waterproof. If it rained, they leaked. If it stormed, they tore. And if they tore, the rain came in sideways, slapping your bed and your soup like it was personally offended by your existence. There's a joke from a 12th century English tavern poem that goes: he asked for a window, she offered a hole. He slept beside it and woke in a bowl. That's not fiction, that's weather trauma. Some houses skipped windows entirely. Total darkness. You kept the door open during the day for light and closed it when it rained, which meant you cooked, worked and lived in twilight. This was especially true in winter, when doors stayed shut for warmth and homes turned into dim, smoky caves. Your eyes adjusted. Sort of. If you wanted to see your own hands, you held them up to the fire and hoped they hadn't molded overnight. And yet, light was needed. So what did people do? They used slits high up the wall, covered with fabric or wood. These were opened only when necessary, like tiny barn hatches. In some cases the window was just a missing daub patch they never bothered to fix. Peasants got creative. A wooden board that could be pushed aside, a shutter held in place with leather ties, a sheep's stomach stretched taut and nailed to a frame like a poor man's stained glass. It worked. For a while. Until it didn't. Historians still argue whether peasants wanted windows or considered them foolish luxuries. Some say small openings were intentional, designed to keep heat in and bad luck out. Others suggest people simply didn't know how to frame and seal a proper window, and why would they? They were more worried about whether tonight's stew had bones or not. And when windows did exist, they became a new maintenance nightmare. Rain found them. Wind abused them. Birds flew through them. Rats didn't even notice them. There's a tragicomic tale from Normandy about a woman named Sabette whose window was struck by a hawk mid-rainstorm. It shattered her bladder cover, knocked over her cheese, and scared her so badly she cursed the sun for a week. But even with all this, people tried. They craved daylight. They carved small holes where they could, decorated them with bits of wool or charms to keep evil out. Children painted on the parchment with berries. Sometimes, light was luxury. Imagine the rain has passed. You're tired. Your house smells like smoke and wet straw. You step to the wall, untie a tiny flap, and let in a square of morning light. It spills across the table. You exhale. And for a moment your home feels, not dry, but bearable. Then the wind shifts, and it slaps a splash of rainwater right into your porridge. Back to the flap. The thatch fire lottery. Everyone played, no one wanted to win. Because while rain was a slow-soaking enemy, fire was swift, merciless, and loud. And if you lived in a peasant hut topped with dried straw, shared a wall with 3 neighbors, and cooked every meal over an open flame beneath a sagging soot-stained ceiling, then congratulations. You lived one spark away from medieval fireworks. Let's be honest, thatch was a fire waiting to happen. It was dry, brittle, and packed in thick bundles. Sometimes it had moss or bird nests tangled deep inside. Sometimes the straw had already started to rot or mold, which made it extra flammable. And remember, there was no chimney.
just a central fire pit, and the naive hope that smoke would rise up and not sideways. It often chose sideways, and when it curled up into the thatch, boom, well whoosh, technically. That's how quickly it happened. One rogue ember, one pop of fat from a cooking pot, one breeze that nudged a spark just far enough. And suddenly the air smelled different, hotter, sharper. And you heard that terrible sound, the crackle that wasn't cooking. Now here's the cruel part. Many homes only realized the roof was on fire after it was already halfway gone. Why? Because the smoke was always there. You were used to it. The air inside your house was already so grey and thick, most people couldn't spot new smoke from old. Not until someone said, "Is it hotter in here?" or the ceiling started to glow. Cue the panic. Everyone grabbed whatever they could, buckets, pots, cloaks, wet rushes, to douse the flames. But it rarely worked. The fire moved fast. The thatch burned like dry grass on a summer hillside. And if your home was attached to others, which it often was, it spread. Across rooftops, into walls, down to the livestock pen. Some fires ate entire hamlets in under an hour. And there wasn't a fire department. There were neighbors. If they liked you, they helped. If they didn't, well, good luck. There's a grimly famous incident from Sussex in 1297, where a pig knocked over a lantern, setting the family home ablaze. The fire jumped to 2 other cottages. In total 7 homes burned. The pig survived. The villagers joked for years that it was possessed, or a miracle, or a very angry bacon god. Ulrich, yes, our bucket-wielding friend, would have been helpless in that moment. Because there weren't enough buckets. There wasn't enough water. Wells were deep, barrels were scarce. And your only real hope was rain. Sweet blessed rain. The very thing that made your walls rot might be the only thing that saved your house from vanishing in a puff of smoke. Historians still argue whether fire was a more common cause of household destruction than storm damage. Some say yes, citing manorial records that describe entire hamlets wiped out by great flame. Others point out that storm damage was more frequent, just less spectacular. Either way, fire was feared deeply. It was fast. It was final. And it never gave you a second chance. Let's not forget, everything inside was flammable too. The straw mattress, the rushes on the floor, the wooden table, the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the wool tunic you left too close to the fire. And once your house was ash, you didn't just lose shelter, you lost everything. Your bread, your tools, your bedding, your only warm cloak, the spoon your father carved, the cradle you hoped to pass down. Some families rebuilt, others didn't. And yet people kept cooking over open flame, under roofs made of straw, in towns where the houses were closer together than teeth in a hungry mouth. Why? Because there wasn't another option. Tiles were too expensive, chimneys were luxury items, stone houses were for priests, lords and ghosts. And fire, terrifying as it was still essential. You needed it to cook, to warm, to live. So you gambled. Every day, you stirred your pot carefully, you blew on your kindling softly. You kept your cloak damp, just in case. Some people got superstitious, hung charms to ward off sparks, dipped straw in salt water, sprinkled holy ash in the hearth. Did it work? No, but it helped them sleep, until they didn't. Because someday, maybe tonight, the thatch might light. And your whole life, roof to floor, would vanish into the stars. The invasion of the slugs. A phrase no one includes in medieval history textbooks, but one every peasant remembered with an exhausted groan and a soggy boot. Because when your walls are made of damp mud, your floors are mud, and your roof is dripping mud, the slugs arrive. And not just 1 or 2. Oh no. An army. A quiet, glistening, oozing army, on a slow motion march across your belongings, your walls, and if you were unlucky, your face. Let's be clear. The medieval peasant home was not a house, not a shelter, a biome, and slugs. They were the apex nuisance. The combination of rot and low airflow turned every corner of the average peasant hut into paradise for moisture-loving invertebrates. Slugs emerged from under mats, slid down beams and slimed across cold bread, like it was a spa day. They didn't care that this was your only loaf. They didn't care that you were sleep. They just existed, fat and unbothered, leaving trails on every surface like they were tagging your home with their wet signature. It started with the corners, darker, damper, mostly ignored. You'd spot one there, coiled beside your firewood, just vibing. Then you'd spot 5 more under the water bucket. And by the end of the week, you were waking up to the squish of something soft under your foot, followed by the slow creeping realization. It moved. Children cried. Adults swore. Goats sometimes ate them. No one really knew what to do about slugs. They weren't dead, just offensive, unhygienic, undefeated. Some tried salt, others ash. A few brave souls introduced ducks into the home, just to curb the slime tide. But the ducks brought noise, and smell, and poop, and eventually, most peasants just gave up and added slug patrol to the mental checklist of miserable things they could do nothing about. Let's talk about beds, or rather straw pallets on the floor that you shared with your own sweat, your children, and the occasional curious frog. These beds, prime slug real estate, warm, moist, undisturbed during the day. A good slug could cross the full width of your sleeping area by dawn, leaving a shimmering road map of its journey across your blankets, your cheek, and your dignity. A woman named Edith, living near the Devon marshes, became known for her nightly ritual, checking her bedding with a stick before lying down. Just a poke for pee, she called it. Once, she claimed to have found 11 slugs in one night. Her neighbors didn't believe her, until she dumped them all in a bowl, and labeled it proof. That bowl, to this day, is probably still more sanitary than the average midi. And all the kitchen. You didn't just lose sleep to slugs. You lost food. They went for cabbage, onions, bread crust, the rims of wooden bob, the ladle you forgot to hang. Sometimes they drowned themselves in your stew, just to make a statement. A bubbling pot left uncovered for even a few minutes became a risk. And if you stirred too fast without checking, crunch, dinner ruined. Historians rarely mention slugs in their grand summaries of medieval life. They talk about famine, war, and religion, but not the humble mollusk. Yet ask anyone who's reconstructed a medieval peasant home today, and they'll tell you, the slugs come back, just like they did in 1223, and 1179, and every reign it ever followed, because it wasn't about cleanliness. You could sweep daily, you could throw out your rushes, you could pray to every saint, from Agatha to Z. But when the walls bled moisture, and the floor squelched, the slugs answered the call. Even modern reconstructions, carefully crafted museum replicas of peasant homes, see slug problems within weeks. Scholars tried to ignore it at first. Now they include it on the visitor tours. Watch your step. Medieval authenticity includes unwanted guests. It's almost fun, in a tragic, sleepy kind of way. You survive the plague. You patch the roof. You bail the floor. You swat the rats. And then, a slug, right on your spoon, looking at you like it knows. You can't scream. You can't win. All you can do is sigh, wipe it off, and go back to your stew. Because in a medieval peasant home, there's always something slimier than your luck. Waterproofing with wishful thinking. That's really what it boiled down to. Because for all the mudslinging, daub patching, straw stuffing efforts medieval peasants put into keeping their homes dry, the truth was this: there were no guarantees. There were barely technique. There was just optimism and desperation, and the vague hope that maybe this time the rain wouldn't come through that corner. Spoiler, it did. Let's talk about what waterproofing meant in a world without plastic tarps, sealants, or even consistent nails. First came the natural methods: herbs, oils, ashes. Peasants would smear animal fat on thatch to help repel water, or rub wax along exposed They boiled down pine resin, or used leftover cooking grease to coat door frames. Did it work? Sort of. Briefly, until it washed off. Or the rats ate. That's it. Then there was the mystical route. Hang dried herbs in the rafters. Sage, rosemary, or yarrow, to protect the roof from sky wrath. Paint symbols with charcoal on the threshold, to hold back the storm. One man in Cornwall carved a rune into every support beam of his house. His neighbours mocked him until their roofs collapsed and his stayed dry. After that, everyone suddenly needed blessed charcoal. Of course, the most common solution was daub. Again, more daub, always more. If it cracked, smear it. If it sagged, smear it. If it slogged off in sheets and hit the goat, smear it again. They mixed in straw, dung, lime, ashes, anything to help it cling to the walls longer. But the wetter the weather, the less it mattered. Daub doesn't like rain. Daub pretends to resist it. But in the end, daub just delays the inevitable. There's a story from Yorkshire of a woman named Lena who insisted on making a secret daub, which included ground up snail shells, spoiled milk, and a pinch of her husband's beer. It didn't work. The walls still fell, but her neighbours claimed the house smelled oddly pleasant when it collapsed. So, partial win. Now, let's talk about thatch maintenance. One of the few things that did help was keeping your thatch thick and steeply pitched. Rain slides down steep roofs better than shallow ones. But thick thatch meant more straw, and more straw meant more money. So peasants layered what they had, and hoped gravity would pick up the slack. Sometimes, they'd weigh it down with turf, or wood. Other times, they'd simply pray the birds didn't pick it clean. Crows, starlings, even magpies, all loved thatch. One historian even noted that a hungry bird may undo the work of 2 days in an hour. Nothing says hope is dead like watching your roof flap away in a bird's beak. There were also floor tricks. Some dug shallow trenches inside the home to direct water toward a designated puddle area. Others laid flat stones in walking paths or stuffed straw under their mats as sacrificial layers. Some even built little wooden platforms to sleep on, lifted just high enough to remove the puddles. It wasn't elegant, but it beat drowning in your sleep. Historians still argue about how widespread these waterproofing techniques. Some claim there was real knowledge passed down by generations. Others insist most of it was superstition and trial, but the truth is probably both. A little wisdom, a lot of guesswork, and an overwhelming amount of knowledge. And through it all, hope. Hope that the patch would hold, that the beam wouldn't rot through, that the weird-smelling wax would actually repel something, that the storm would veer left this time, that the leak above the baby's head had finally been fixed. Because medieval peasants weren't fools. They knew their homes were beaming fortresses, but they weren't quitters either. Every season, they tried again, redaubed, rethatched, recoated, even when they knew it would fail. Eventually, they kept going, and maybe that's the real waterproofing. Not resin, not snail goo, not even Elric's bucket brigade, just stubbornness, the kind that tells you to smear the walls one more time, even when your shoes haven't been dry since. Historians still argue, was this livable? It's the question that lingers behind every reconstructed peasant home, every dirt floor museum exhibit, every politely sanitized YouTube video where a cheerful host says, medieval people, but did they, really? Did they live in these houses? Or did they just Because when you lay it all out, the leaking thatch, the collapsing daub, the swampy floor, the mud, the smoke, the rats, the slugs, it's not just inconvenient, it sounds uninhabitable, like the kind of place a building inspector would run from, whooping, and yet, it was home, for generations. So were they resilient, or just trapped? Let's take it apart. On one side of the debate, you have the adaptation camp. These scholars argue that medieval peasants developed survival skills, suited perfectly to their environment. They understood the seasons. They knew which herbs kept bugs away. They had generational knowledge about daub mixes, thatch thickness, and how to choose high ground. Some anthropologists even point out that these homes were sustained by local materials, renewable resources, low carbon footprint. But then there's the other camp, the miserable endurance crew. The ones who say, no, this wasn't adaptation, this was entrapment. People lived like this because they had no choice. They were born into poverty, tied to land. They didn't taxed by lords, harassed by weather, weakened by malnutrition, and offered no structural alternative. Their homes weren't designed for comfort. They were allowed to exist, just barely. And then there's the evidence. Accounts of chronic illness, archaeological remains of children with rickets, adults with lung damage, bones deformed from years of hard labor and damp environments, written records of entire families buried after their roof collapsed in a storm, of diseases spreading through wet floors and leaking. One peasant diary, rare as it is, mentions the phrase, "We live not in houses, but in apologies for them." That doesn't sound like contentment. That sounds like resignation. Still, there's another level. Because even with all this suffering, people lived lives in these sang, tooked, held, but they be sat by the fire, told stories. They didn't just survive. They created me. They found comfort where they could. Edith, the widow with the slug box, once hosted a spring gathering. After 3 weeks of the guests sat on stools, balanced on flat stuff, drank thin ale, out roasted leeks. She said, "The smoke keeps the gossip from sticking to the rafters." Everyone laughed. That hut meant had been collapsing, but it was still a home. Historians today are torn between romanticizing that spirit and acknowledging the harshness. Was it noble simplicity or squalor? Was it community strength or systemic neglect? Maybe it was both. Maybe medieval peasant homes weren't built for thriving, but thriving still happened anyway. Old bursts, like daisies in a ditch, like music in a rain, like a child dancing in puddles, while the roof leaks, and the stew is thin, and the goat has eaten the laundry again. Modern reconstructions struggle to capture this balance. They're too clean, too staged, too quiet. They don't smell, they don't drip, they don't squish. You can't see the moss, or feel the cold rising from the earth into you don't wake up coughing, because your blanket is wet again. So yes, historians still argue. Was it livable? Depends on how you define life. If live means shelter in the body, then yes, these homes did that. If live means feeling safe, dry, warm, and healthy, then not consistently, not for long. But if live means enduring, adapting, rebuilding, singing anyway, then perhaps the peasant home, with all its flaws and fungi, was a place where life happened, imperfectly, resiliently, muddily, and maybe that's enough. Building codes, try local gossip. In the medieval village, there was no town inspector, no planning commission, no clipboard guy named Roger, in a fluorescent vest. Your building permit was a shrug from the and maybe a grunt of approval from your neighbor. Home stacked too big without them falling. The only real code was what the others thought of your handiwork, and they were watching. Medieval peasants lived in tight, often claustrophobic houses were packed together, like damp books on a warped shelf. Everyone knew what everyone else was building, patching, or pretending not to fix. So when you started constructing, or repairing your home, you weren't just raising a wall, you were putting on a performance. And people talked. "Oh, did you see what Aldwin used to patch his daub? Looked like turnip mash. Isn't that the same roof that caved in lastly? I wouldn't sleep under it." If St. Peter himself held the big, her wattle looks like it's trying to escape. Someone should tell her. This wasn't just idle chatter, it was social regulation. Your reputation as a builder, or botcher, followed you. If you put your door on backward, or made your hearth too close to the sleeping area, you heard about it. Not from officials, but from a Felfgifu down the road, who once built a chicken coop that lasted 6 winters, and wouldn't let you forget it. And yes, there were unwritten rules, passed down like gossip, enforced like law. Walls should be thick enough to block wind, but not so thick they collapse under their own ambition. Roofs should overhang just enough to shed rain, but not so much that the neighbours accuse you of hogging the runoff. Doorposts must be buried deep, not just because they'll fall over, but because if they don't lean at the right angle, everyone will say, "Your house has shifty shoulders." One man in Somerset built a round hut, just to be different. They called him Loophouse Leofric. For the rest of his life, it leaked in every direction, by the way. But he stood by it, said he was pioneering weather neutrality, whatever that meant. Still, some villagers took pride in their hut. A well-built hut could bring prestige. A thatched job that didn't leak for 2 years earned nods in the market. People would ask, who patched your roof? Like it was a celebrity endorsement. And if your daub held up through 2 storms, you bragged. You offered unsolicited advice. You stood beside your home and waited for compliments, like a man show. But if your house fell, you became a cautionary tale. Don't do what old Rick did with his corner post. Nearly killed the goat. Did you hear about the roof that Kate backed in during the baptism? Baptized the whole family. And woe unto the peasant, who ignored the wisdom of the elders. She wouldn't mix ash in the daub, they'd whisper. Said she knew better. Look at her now, living with the chickens. Still, gossip wasn't always cruel. Sometimes it was how knowledge survived. You'd hear about someone using river clay instead of hillside mud, and having fewer cracks, or using old wool in the walls for insulation, or weaving their wattle tighter with fresh green saplings, so it wouldn't shift. It dry. Innovation spread through whispers, through envy, through the communal art of judging each other constructively. Historians still debate how standardized village construction was. Some argue that peasants followed long-standing patterns and understood what worked, trial and error shaped by generations of story. Others think it was chaos with everyone doing their best with whatever they had, nodding sagely while slathering fresh pig dung on a collapsing wall. What we know is this: even without written codes, there was and it lived in the mouths of your neighbors.
So when you stood outside your hut, staring at a crack in the daub and wondering whether to patch it now or after market, you weren't just weighing the rain forecast, you were weighing the risk of being the next story told over mead. Because in medieval villages, building failures weren't just structural, they were social. And if you got it right, you became a legend. You know that house, the one that didn't leak last winter. That's Wolfstan's. Say what you want about his onions, but the man can lay a beam. High praise. Medieval style. The communal roof-fixing fiasco. It always started with a leak. A bad one. Usually above someone's bed or directly into the soup pot. At first you'd ignore it, shift the bed, stir around the drip, but then came the second leak, the third, and finally the entire roof began to sound like a drum line during storms, and that's when you had no choice but to fix it. But you weren't going to do it alone, because fixing a medieval peasant roof wasn't a solo mission. It was a community ordeal. Equal parts construction project, neighborhood drama, and outdoor theater. If your thatch was failing, chances were good your neighbor's was too. So you made a deal. I'll help with yours if you help with mine. Then your cousin joined. Then your cousin's cousin. Then the drunk old man who lived by the stream offered to supervise. And that's when the trouble really began. You see, everyone had opinions. Ulrich, the bucket guy, thought he knew the roof's weak spots better than you did. Baborn insisted on layering the straw, Northman style, even though no one knew what that meant. Edith, who had never actually patched a roof in her life, brought a handful of herbs and said sprinkling them in the straw would keep out evil spirits and mice. You smiled. You nodded. You let her do it. What choice did you have? And then came the actual work. First you needed new straw, preferably long-stemmed wheat straw, not broken bits or mouldy bundles. This meant raiding the barn, borrowing from neighbors, or in desperate cases, trading eggs or favors for decent bundles. There was always someone hoarding the good thatch, and everyone knew who it was. Once you had materials, you needed a ladder, maybe two. Not that you had real ladders. You had a wobbly wooden frame someone swore was a fence last week. You leaned it against the sagging side of your house, prayed to St. Jude, patron of lost causes, and started climbing. At this point, the entire village was watching. Children pointed and laughed. Elders muttered criticisms from benches. The reeve strolled by and offered useless advice like, "Patch high to low, lads. as if you weren't already battling gravity and wet straw with frozen fingers. And then someone slipped. Always. Landed in the pig pen. Or on the firewood. Or flat on top of poor Wulfric's pickled turnip barrel. You'd pause, check for broken bones, and then, because this was peasant life, you'd keep going. But here's the kicker. Every time you fixed one leak, two more showed up. Thatch is tricky. Lay it too thin, and water sneaks through. Too thick, and it sags. Tie it too loose and the wind takes it. Too tight and it cracks. It's like trying to knit a sweater that also needs to repel storms and not catch fire when someone sneezes near the hearth. Eventually the sun would start to set, and someone would say, "That's good enough for today." Even though it wasn't. Even though half the bundles were crooked and someone used barley straw by accident. You'd climb down, filthy and bruised, and stare at your roof with the grim satisfaction of a job technically completed. And that night, it would rain, and a new leak would form, directly above your head. Historians often wonder how medieval communities managed to maintain even minimal housing with no formal training. The answer: they didn't. Not perfectly. They relied on each other, on shared effort, shared mistakes, shared laughter and curses and bruised ribs. Roof repairs weren't about quality. They were about trying. Together. Some anthropologists call this subsistence construction. But honestly, it was a kind of messy, muddy miracle. And the next day, you'd wake up, soaked, sigh deeply, and say the words every peasant knew by heart. Well, at least the kitchen's dry. If the roof collapsed, that was Tuesday. Because in a medieval peasant's life, disaster didn't knock politely or wait for a full moon. It just happened. Usually during supper. A sudden crack. A whoosh of wind. And then thud. That was the ceiling. It gave up. So did the rafters. The roof that had bravely sagged for 5 years too long, finally sighed, snapped and dropped itself, along with about 40 pounds of straw, sticks, soot, and one very startled rat, into your evening stew. And the reaction: not screams, not panic, just a long pause, a sigh, and maybe, well, we were meaning to fix that. Because roof collapses weren't rare, they were expected. Part of the rhythm of rural life. Thatch rotted, beams warped, tying cords frayed, and sooner or later gravity won. Let's go through the anatomy of failure. It started with a slow bend in one of the main timbers. Just a little. Not enough to notice at first, until you walked into the house one day and had to duck slightly lower than usual. Then came the small creaks. The bits of straw dropping gently, like ceiling dandruff. Then came the puddles. You'd place a bucket. Then two. Then one morning, you'd find the bucket filled with half your roof. If you were lucky, the whole roof didn't fall at once. Just a section. Preferably over the livestock corner or where no one was sleeping. But luck was a rare guest in peasant homes. More often, someone took a thatch clump to the head during dinner or had their blanket turned into a straw cocoon overnight. There's a record from Lincolnshire in the 1320s of a man named Oswin, whose roof collapsed in winter, trapping him under his own firewood stack. He was rescued 3 hours later by neighbors with a pitchfork and a prayer. When asked how he was, he reportedly said, "Warmer than I've ever been." And rebuilding. It wasn't an emergency response team situation. No sirens. No insurance claims. It was just you, your aching back, and whoever could be bribed with ale and the promise of future help. You'd salvage what wasn't crushed. Reti what you could. Borrow straw. Maybe patch the beam with one you found in the woods and hoped wasn't already half chewed by beetles. And while you worked, The rest of the village would offer moral support. I always said that beam was too thin. Your roof lasted longer than mine did last spring. You should have used a sharper angle. Everyone knows rain slides better at a pitch. Thanks everyone. Real helpful. Roof collapses weren't just common. They became cultural landmarks. That was the year after Edda's roof came down. I had just finished re-thatching mine when Bjorn's caught fire. We were married the week after the hut fell on my uncle. Historians argue about whether this constant failure discouraged innovation. Why didn't they try better materials? Build higher walls? Invent better architecture? The answer is they couldn't. Timber was scarce. Tools were primitive. Time was limited. And you didn't build for comfort. You built for survival. If the roof stayed up long enough to get you through harvest and one more winter, that was considered a win. Longevity was for churches and castles. Peasants aimed for doesn't collapse this week. And even when it did collapse, you kept going. You swept the straw off the stew. You moved the bedrolls to the driest patch. You patted down the goat and apologized. Then you got to work. Because no one else was going to build your roof for you. There's a kind of heroism in that. A soggy, splinter-covered, soot-faced heroism. Quiet and uncelebrated. No medals. No history books. Just another Tuesday. Another beam. Another chance to keep the rain out for one more night. Even if it meant eating your supper with a roof tile in your lap. Smells like wet goat forever. That wasn't a complaint. It was just reality. The scent of a medieval peasant home wasn't something you could ever truly describe. You didn't walk into it so much as enter it the way you might enter a fog bank. Slowly, cautiously, and fully aware that whatever hit your nose first would stay there for the rest of the day. But the reigning champion of domestic odors. Always the wet goat. Let's be fair. Goats weren't the only smell. But they were the loudest. The most consistent. Especially in the rain. Because when it poured, and it always poured, everything smelled. The house filled with dampness. The wood absorbed it. The straw floor fermented beneath your feet. The fire sputtered out, leaving behind that distinctive cold ash and broken dreams aroma. Mold bloomed. Rot crept. But it was the goats who truly defined the signature bouquet of your life. And why were they in the house? Because it was wetter outside. Most peasants didn't have separate stables. Animals were brought indoors to protect them from predators, thieves, or simply because you didn't want to find your only milk-giving goat frozen stiff in a ditch the next morning. So they lived with you. Sometimes penned in the corner. Sometimes not penned at all. And wet goats. Oh, they stank. It wasn't just water on fur. It was a sour musk that filled the room like bad news. A mix of manure, old hay, wet earth, and whatever fungal party was happening in their hooves. When a goat shook itself dry beside the hearth, the smell multiplied, atomized, distributed evenly throughout the air like some kind of medieval Febreze with malicious intent. And the smell stayed. It soaked into the daub, into the rushes, into your cloak, into your soul. You'd carry it with you all day. People would smell you before they saw you. And no one judged. Because they smelled like wet goat too. Children smelled like wet goat. Blankets smelled like wet goat. The family bread sometimes absorbed a faint animal tang that no one commented on anymore. Tastes warm was good enough. And then came the layering. Because it wasn't just the goat. It was the stew pot bubbling in the corner with 3 ingredients and 7 guesses. The smoke that never left. The old cabbage that had fused into a corner of the room so thoroughly it probably had voting rights. The boots lined up by the door. Soaked, cracked, fungal, fragrant. There was no ventilation. No airflow. The tiny window slits were often plugged with cloth to keep out the rain, which meant smells had nowhere to go. They lived there, just like you did. You didn't light a candle to mask them. You just hoped the fire burned hot enough to make your nostrils numb. And yes, people tried to cope. Some sprinkled herbs on the floor, mint, lavender, wormwood, anything mildly pleasant. Others burned pine cones. A few chewed aromatic roots so that at least their breath could rise above the muck. But nothing competed with wet goat. It was the olfactory overlord of your home. There's a legend in East Anglia of a woman named Hilda, who once kicked her goat out during a storm because she couldn't take the smell anymore. The goat promptly broke through the door, knocked over the firewood stack, and urinated on her bedding. Her neighbors called it divine punishment. Hilda just called it Tuesday. Historians still debate what a medieval peasant noticed versus what they endured. Did they go nose-blind to the scent of their homes? Probably. Did they still talk about it? Oh yes. Jokes were made. Songs were sung. One tavern ditty from the 14th century begins: "My love smells of lilacs, her house of despair, of mildew and goat hair and smoke in the air." Romantic? No. Accurate? Absolutely. Modern attempts to recreate peasant homes in museums always miss this part. They're too sterile, too clean. You walk into a tidy reconstruction with soft lighting and think, I could live like this. But add a little rain, a few animals, 2 damp cloaks, a spoiled turnip, and one very active goat. You'd be clawing at the walls within 20 minutes. And yet somehow they lived in it. Not by ignoring it, not by pretending it wasn't awful, but by accepting it, by laughing through it, by stepping out into the fresh air, taking a deep breath, and saying, doesn't smell like inside, because inside always smelled like goat. Forever. Seasonal flooding. A feature, not a bug. If you lived in a medieval peasant hut, you didn't brace for spring flooding. You scheduled around it. It was less of a surprise and more of a ritual, like Lent, or planting season, or the annual realization that the patch you made in your wall last autumn had all the structural integrity of porridge. Because when the seasons changed, your house changed with it, often into a marsh. Let's set the stage. It's early April. The snow has melted. The rains have returned. The fields are sloshing with joy. Birds are singing. Streams are swelling. And your home has become a sponge. It starts small, just a dark patch in the corner, where the floor seems a little softer, a squish when you step. You smile nervously, tell yourself it's just spring dew, and shift your sleeping mat 6 inches to the left. But then overnight, it spreads. The corner becomes a puddle, the puddle becomes a pool, and suddenly your house has zones. Dryish, moist, and do not step there, unless you want to lose a boot. And this didn't happen just once. It was annual, predictable, the same way you marked your calendar for harvest and holy days. You braced for what one 14th century farmer called the rising of the indoors. Why? Because drainage was a fantasy. Peasant homes were built low, often on earth that had already been trampled and compacted for years. Foundations, don't make me laugh. Some huts were below ground level from decades of foot traffic and gradual sinking. So when rain came, and it always came, the water didn't run away, it ran in. And if your home was near a stream or pond, because water is life, then congratulations. You were now also managing a seasonal moat. Some villages even had names for their springtime house pools. Eelrick's Pit, the Duck Bed, God's Bowl. One tale from a Dorset village recalls a woman named Sibley, who planted reeds in her corner puddle out of sheer defiance. If it wants to be a pond, she said, then let it be beautiful. It wasn't, but it did attract frogs, and frogs eat bugs. So maybe she was onto something. Now let's talk consequences. Wet rushes on the floor turned slimy.
Mold exploded, bedding reeked, children developed mysterious rashes that no one could explain, and everyone just called April skin. And livestock, especially pigs, would try to wallow indoors. You'd wake up to snorting beside your head and realize the pig had claimed the driest spot in the house. And who could blame it? Food storage. Hilarious. Unless your grain was on a shelf high on a shelf, it soaked up moisture like a doomed biscuit. Sometimes sacks burst. Other times you just found tiny white sprouts poking through and decided, oh well, guess it's planting itself now. People got sick. Feet stayed damp. Coughs deepened. Rheumatism flared. Babies slept in laps, not on floors, because the idea of putting them down was like laying them in a puddle of medieval broth. And yet there were no sandbags, no sump pumps, just coping. Peasants lifted furniture onto rocks, built narrow boardwalks inside, laid extra straw in the worst areas, and hoped it didn't rot too fast. Some got clever, digging shallow trenches inside the house to channel water out the door. One man near the fens claimed he could make his stew pot float from the hearth to the door in only 3 pushes. That was pride. Medieval pride. Historians often marvel at how little changed structurally in peasant dwellings for centuries. You'd think that after generations of flooding, people would innovate, build higher, seal foundations, move uphill, and some did, but most they couldn't. The land they lived on wasn't theirs, the tools weren't available, and the weather didn't negotiate. So instead of fighting nature, they adapted. They named the puddles, they joked about the leaks, they boasted about the one corner that never flooded, and they endured. Because in the end, a seasonal flood wasn't a crisis, it was just spring, and if your floor could support a duck, well, at least that's fresh eggs right there. How they laughed through the drizzle. Because what else could they do? When your ceiling weeps, your stew grows moss, and your boots squish before you even step outside, you either find humor, or you lose your mind. And medieval peasants, soggy, overworked, perpetually cold, chose humor, not out of optimism, not because things were fine, but because laughter was often the only thing that couldn't be soaked, stolen, or ruined by the rain. Let's be clear, the jokes weren't refined. They weren't embroidered onto tapestries or preserved in illuminated manuscripts, but they existed in whispers at the alehouse, in barbed comments between neighbors, in muttered one-liners as someone's roof fell in behind them. And they were sharp. You dry yet? Drier than your thatch. Well, that's not saying much. Sarcasm was the village sport. Everyone knew whose wall had collapsed, whose stew tasted like mildew, and who still hadn't fixed the hole above the bed. No one was spared, especially not Ulrich, our beloved bucket man, who once stepped into his own puddle trap, and was found in the morning sitting in a washtub like a confused duck. He got roasted for weeks. Children joined in. They sang little songs like Rain, Rain Go Away, Leave Our Daub Another Day, Drip on Bjorn's Leaky Floor. He said he patched it. What a ball. There was always a big bond. And if a neighbor's house finally gave way dramatically, soggily, and inevitably, everyone showed up to help after making a joke about it. Oh, I see your thatch has decided to retire early. You were always saying you wanted more sky in your life. It was never cruel. Not really. Because everyone was one storm away from being the next punchline. In taverns, people competed to tell the most exaggerated leak stories. I slept standing up for 3 nights. My stew pot filled with roof water, and I just added onions. The mold on my wall asked if it could sublet, and laughter somehow made it bearable, because there was no escaping the discomfort. No dry season long enough to erase the damp from your bones. You couldn't buy your way out. You couldn't move to a better neighborhood, but you could laugh at the absurdity. A man once told his wife, "We're not poor, We're water rich. She didn't smile until the following Tuesday. But still, humor seeped into rituals too. Spring cleansing often involved a mock ceremony, where someone would be crowned Lord of the Leap, wearing a thatched crown and holding a dripping pot like a royal scepter. He'd walk from house to house declaring, "Your wall is a soup, your bed floats like a boat," and everyone would cheer, because they knew the same fate awaited them next. Historians sometimes miss this emotional infrastructure. They write about tax rolls and rainfall records, but they forget the laughter, the resilience disguised as mockery. Jokes were a form of defiance, a way to remind yourself that even if the house collapsed, the spirit didn't. And the jokes weren't always shared aloud. Some were whispered in the dark, as a roof leaked into a bowl beside the bed. And someone muttered, "Well, I always wanted an indoor pond." Or when you awoke to your cloak covered in slug trails and said, "Ah, the messengers of the rain have written again." Or when your stew was mostly rainwater, and someone said, "It's soup of the day. Today's flavor is roof." Not because it fixed anything, but because it gave you something to hold on to when everything else was damp and slipping. And maybe that's the heart of medieval humor. Not punchlines, but anchors. A way to say, "I see the misery, I name it, and I laugh at it, because it doesn't get to take me with it." So when it rained, and it always rained, they kept living, kept working, kept joking, because in a world made of mud, fire, and damp straw, a good laugh was the only thing that stayed dry. You wouldn't last one storm, not a winter, not a season, just one good storm. One midnight downpour, with wind shrieking through the big, rain smashing the thatch, and the walls sweating like they've just seen a ghost. That's all it would take for most modern people to break. And medieval peasants, they didn't break, they braced, they listened, they curled up next to their smouldering hearths, with cloaks over their heads and waited it out. But you'd notice the cold first. It wouldn't just bite. It would climb into your fingers, into your spine, into your thoughts. You'd press against the wall for warmth, and it would press back damp and crumbling. Then the drip would begin. Not one, several, uneven, random, like the house was crying, and couldn't decide which tear to shed first. Your mat would soak, your blanket would cling, your toes would squish against the rushes and discover, horrifically, that something down there moved. You'd look up trying to find the source, and the thatch would groan like an old man about to confess something terrible. The wind would punch through a gap you didn't know existed. The smoke from your fire, already choking and lazy, would turn on you circling low, like it had something to prove. The baby would cry, the dog would bark, the goat, because of course the goat is inside, would bleat in protest, then urinate defiantly in the driest patch of floor you had left, and then crack. A portion of the roof lets go. Not a full collapse, just enough to splatter cold water across your stew, your pillow, and your sense of optimism. And still the storm goes on. You'd panic, fumble for a bucket, discover it's already full from the last leak, step into the corner, slip, curse, cough, cry, pray. You'd wrap yourself in a damp cloak and shiver like it was a form of penance. You'd press your feet against the hearth and wonder if hypothermia was invented just for you. And outside, the wind would laugh, and the mud would thicken, and your only thought would be, how did they live like this? But they did. They endured that storm, and the next one, and the 100 before it. They mopped, they wrung, they patched with straw, smeared fresh dough, stuffed the cracks with wool, sang through the smoke and dared the wind to try again. They whispered bedtime tales about fireproof thatch and mold-free walls. Not because they believed them, but because hope was cheaper than straw. And in the morning, They'd open the crooked door, breathe the mist, and assess the damage with the grim curiosity of people who'd seen worse. Then they'd boil water, dry the spoons, and say things like, well, at least the pig didn't get out this time. But you'd call it quits before breakfast. So no, you wouldn't last one stop. But they did. And not because they were stronger, but because they had no other option. Because survival wasn't a choice. It was a reflex. One bucket, one laugh, one more patched roof at a time. Leaky roofs and social hierarchies. Because in the Middle Ages, even the drip knew its place. The more it leaked, the lower you probably were. A bad roof wasn't just a construction flaw. It was a class distinction you could feel on your scalp. And while every peasant home had its fair share of leaks, how many you had and what you could do about them spoke volumes about where you stood in the soggy pyramid of rural life. Let's start with the obvious. If you were rich, you didn't live under thatch. You lived under tile, slate, wood shingles, something flat, heavy and blessedly waterproof. Your roof didn't catch fire during a lightning storm. It shook it off. Your hearth had a chimney, and your dog didn't fall off when it rained sideways. In fact, you didn't patch your house at all. You paid someone else to do it. And if they failed, you sued them, or yelled, or had a steward do both at once. But the peasant, no tile, no chimney, just straw. And the hope that this spring's rainstorm didn't undress the whole roof in front of the livestock. The gap widened further when you looked at who among the peasants had slightly better homes. The reeve, the village official, usually had a sturdier structure. Maybe 2 rooms, maybe walls that didn't lean like they were in mourning. Why? Because he was trusted with organizing labor. And he wasn't going to do that while ankle deep in puddles. Then came the miller, the blacksmith, tradesman, who brought value to the manor, and could afford better materials, or had access to timber, nails, and actual tools. Their roofs weren't perfect, but they leaked politely, one drop at a time, not an Indom waterfall. You envied them for it. Everyone else, well, the rain sorted you out, and people noticed. They knew which houses dripped and which ones poured. They knew which family always borrowed straw in spring, who was constantly redaubing the same wall, whose house smelled like despair and old goat year round. You couldn't hide it. The storm exposed all. In fact, village gossip thrived on rainfall. Nothing revealed the cracks in your status quite like a 2-day downpour. The social hierarchy was practically audible. Bucket clatter by bucket clatter. She says they're comfortable, but I saw her son bailing with a boot. Did you hear? Milda's roof gave out during Vespers. The priest said it was a sign. Oh, look who's re-thatching again. 3rd time this year. Maybe if she didn't buy that fancy apron. It wasn't just about the roof. It was about respect. A home that stayed dry was a symbol of competence, of standing, of quiet pride. One that dripped constantly. A reminder of what you lacked, or worse, what you couldn't fix. Even inside the house, the drip revealed power. Elders got the driest corners. Babies were moved whenever the leak shifted. Fathers claimed the upwind side. Buckets were guarded like treasure. You knew exactly who got wet and who didn't, and what that said about them. There's a bitter little rhyme from the 13th century. The Lord eats dry, the miller eats warm, the reeve mops once, the rest ride the storm. Harsh, yes, true, absolutely. Historians have long debated how visible class was inside peasant communities. This isn't feudal lord versus serf. This is poor versus poorer. But rain doesn't lie. It draws the line right down the middle of your sea. Some tried to climb the hierarchy by improving their homes, saving up for better thatch, trading labour for timber, getting on the reeve's good side for a roof repair favour. But every storm reminded you just how far you had or hadn't come. And yet, despite the inequality, there was shared suffering too, because even the best peasant roofs eventually leaked. Maybe not this storm, maybe not next, but one day it would drip, and when it did, the laughter would return, the buckets would come out, and you'd be back in the same squelching mess as the rest of your neighbors. Different leaks, same rain.
Fire and flood, the ultimate roommates. Because if your medieval house wasn't soaking wet, it was probably on fire. Yes, these were the options. You either spent your night curled around a soggy bedroll listening to the roof drip Morse code into your stew, or you bolted upright to the smell of burning straw, clutching a bucket and shouting things that sounded like prayer, but were mostly panic. There was no happy medium. No just cozy. You lived between the wet and the blazing, and sometimes both. Let's begin with the obvious contradiction. You built your house out of materials that burned easily: wattle, daub, thatch, old wood, dry rushes, and then you lit an open fire inside it. Every day. For cooking, warmth, light, comfort, and sometimes just companionship. Because who needs a dog when your hearth gives off smoke that follows you around like a needy ghost? Now add the roof. It's dry in summer. Brittle, really. It crackles when you touch it, and sparks from your fire float upward because there's no chimney, just a hole in the ceiling that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. Wind catches those sparks, carries them to the thatch, and boom, you've got a second sun in your living room. You think that's rare? No. Thatched roof fires were so common that some villages had communal fire hooks, long poles used to tear off flaming sections before the whole house went up. And if the wind was wrong, your house fire could become the village fire. A bad one could eat half a hamlet in a night. There's a well-documented 1312 incident in Norfolk where a man named Aldwin sneezed while tending his fire and sent a chunk of burning peat rolling onto his straw shoes. He kicked it. It flew. It landed in the roof thatch. 7 homes and a sheepfold were gone by dawn. His nickname for the next 10 years. Flamefoot. Peasants didn't forget, but it wasn't just dry weather that made fires dangerous. Ironically, rainy days were just as risky, because when the house was damp you had to burn hotter fires to stay warm. More wood, more sparks, more chance that one ember would find the perfect gap in the thatch where the rain hadn't reached. Wet on the outside, fire on the inside, a medieval marshmallow, ready to roast. And here's the kicker. You didn't see the fire coming. Smoke was always in the air. It lived in your house. Your eyes watered by default. The walls were blackened with years of soot. So when the fire began, you noticed not by sight, but by heat. Sudden, wrong heat. Or by the goats screaming. Then came the response, frantic, desperate, absurd. No fire brigade. No pumps. Just buckets, cloaks, whatever you could grab. You threw water. You smothered with wet cloths. You screamed for help. And if it was too far gone, you didn't save the house. You saved the tools. The baby, the salted meat. Everything else was offered up to the flames like a really angry sacrifice. Afterward, you didn't mourn publicly. You cursed. You drank. You rebuilt. Neighbors pitched in, not because they liked you, but because they knew they'd be next. Historians still argue which was the greater peasant threat, flood or fire. One ruined slowly, the other quickly. One crept through your walls, the other devoured them. But both taught the same lesson: you owned nothing permanently. Every home was temporary. Every wall was a suggestion. Every roof was on borrowed time. So you lived knowing that tonight could be the night. That drip might turn to collapse. That spark might catch. That goat might panic and kick the fire again. It happened. A lot. And somehow you laughed through it. You mocked your luck. Patched what you could. Slept beside the embers and hoped they behaved. Because medieval survival wasn't about avoiding disaster, it was about getting really good at cleaning up after it. The daub walls. Oh yes, because while the roof got most of the drama, the walls were staging their own little rebellion. You see, medieval peasant walls weren't really walls in the way we think of them. They were opinions, suggestions, crumbly ideas held together with hope, straw, and something alarmingly close to compost. The technical term is wattle-and-daub. Sounds fancy, isn't? First you build a frame, wooden stakes and laths, crisscrossed like a half-hearted basket. That's the wattle. Then you smear it with daub, a mix of clay, mud, animal dung, chopped straw, and sometimes sand or hair. Yes, hair, human or animal. Because what your walls lacked in dignity, they made up for in texture. You slather it on thick, let it dry, and voila, a walls. Sort of. Don't breathe on it. Now imagine what happens when it rains. The outside daub softens. The inside daub starts to sweat. You wake up to flakes of wall dust in your stew. Children draw pictures in the surface with their fingers. If a chicken brushes up against the inside of the house, it leaves a trail like wet chalk. And if someone accidentally leans against the wall during a conversation, well, they're now wearing part of the house. It didn't even take a storm. Just enough damp air, just enough wear, and the daub would start to crumble. Tiny landslides of your living space. A breeze through a crack that wasn't there last week. One moment it's a shelter, the next it's shedding like a molting beast, and so began the daub wars. Constant, relentless, personal. You'd re-daub in the spring, patch in summer, panic repair in autumn, and by winter, you accepted the drafts as penance for having lived. Families developed techniques. Some added more straw for stability. Others used extra manure for stickiness and, unfortunately, smell. Some mixed in lime, if they could afford it. And if your village had a daub master, you worshipped them. Not literally, but close. That person could make a wall last through 2 entire rain cycles. Legend. A man in Sussex named Godwin was known for his secret daub recipe that allegedly resisted the wet. He refused to share it, claiming the Virgin Mary revealed it to him in a dream. Years later, someone found out he just used more cow urine. Divine indeed. The daub walls weren't just about staying dry. They were about status. A smooth wall said something. A well-patched corner was admired. Your visitors would touch the inside of your home and nod approvingly, as if to say, yes, this is good done. But if your daub cracked, if it peeled, if it flaked onto your guests, shame. Historians don't write much about this, but people judged. A flaking interior was like wearing tattered clothes. It suggested neglect, weakness, or just bad luck with the rain. And every home had its problem wall, the one that never held up. You patched it every month, and every month it betrayed you. Children played daub or not. By poking walls with sticks, you swore at it, prayed over it, sang to it during repairs. Anything to keep it holding just a little longer. One old rhyme went, the roof will cry, the floor will rot, but curse the wall, you'd better not. It wasn't just about mud and straw. The wall was you, your labor, your sweat, your dignity, smeared by hand and baked by sun. When it failed, you felt it, and yet you kept smearing, even when it rained, even when your hands bled, even when the goat ate part of it. Yes, that happened. You fought your house to stand still, because shelter wasn't granted. It was maintained, with buckets, with laughter, and with a whole lot of daub, rodents, rot, and the revenge of the rushes. If your medieval peasant home wasn't falling down, leaking, burning, or collapsing from daub fatigue, it had one more thing going for it: infestation. Congratulations, you weren't just sheltering your family, you were hosting an accidental Airbnb for every crawling, chewing, nibbling creature within a mile. And guess what? You couldn't charge rent. Let's start with the floor. It wasn't really a floor, it was earth, tamped down from years of stomping, spilling, and existing. If you were lucky, it was packed hard enough to feel like dirt. If you were unlucky, it became mud every spring and autumn and smelled like whatever had recently died in it. To cover this charming surface, Peasants used rushes, bundles of long grass or reeds, laid out like natural carpeting. These were rarely changed, only occasionally refreshed by adding a new layer on top. Over time this meant your floor was made of layers. Not metaphorically, literally. Old rushes underneath, new rushes on top, in between, everything. Dropped food, animal droppings, hair, ash, bones, mold, more droppings, the occasional forgotten tool, and of course rodents. Rats and mice thrived in these soft nesting layers. They built entire civilizations beneath your feet. They were your uninvited roommates. You'd lie awake at night and hear them skittering below. You'd lift a corner of rush and see movement. Feel warmth. Hear that soft demonic chewing sound that meant someone was enjoying your leftover barley porridge with friends. Now cats were sometimes kept for this exact reason. But not all peasants could afford a cat. And besides, cats were divas. They might kill a mouse. Sure. But only when they felt like it. Most nights they just stared at you while the rat walked off with your bread. And here's the worst part. The rats weren't even scared. There are records of rodents gnawing through bed legs, torch racks and even boots. One legend tells of a woman named Tilda, whose baby was born with a rat bite on his ear. Did it happen during labor? Did the rat do it after? No one knew. But the midwife blamed the rushes. Rushes, those innocent-seeming floor decorations, also retained moisture. So when it rained, they soaked up the damp, held it against the earth, and never ever dried. That led to rot. That led to fungus. That led to smells so complex and layered that modern chemists would cry trying to recreate them. And the rushes weren't just on the floor. Some peasants hung them on walls for insulation. Others used bundles as bedding. Either way, you were always close to decomposition. You were sleeping inside a biohazard. Rot crept in silently. It weakened your floor beams. It made your door hinges squeak like they were haunted. It even turned your precious roof supports into soft worm-filled mush. And worms, just more protein for the rats. Some peasants tried tricks, spreading ashes into the rushes to dry them out, sprinkling herbs like tansy or wormwood to drive out vermin, hanging dried mint to mask the smell. These were the medieval equivalents of putting a car air freshener in a moldy basement. Helpful, yes, but laughably optimistic. And yet this was normal. You swept the rushes once in a while, shuffled them around, tossed out the really soggy ones, maybe burned them if you were feeling fancy, but mostly you ignored them, because acknowledging just how gross they were meant admitting that your home was built on layers of dirt, pest hair, and invisible decay. You didn't complain. You couldn't complain. You just walked a little faster over the bad patch, slept on the driest side, told your kids the noise underfoot was just the floor settling, and hoped the rats didn't nibble your toes. And in the morning you smiled, stretched and said, well, at least the roof didn't fall in. Because in a medieval peasant house that counted as a win. The rain was loud, but the silence was louder. Let's step away from the drip, just for a moment. You've heard it 100 times now. The splash into buckets, the patter on thatch, the squelch of mud underfoot. But do you know what was even more deafening in a medieval peasant home? The quiet, and not the peaceful kind. The kind that followed ruin. You see, after the storm, once the wind had exhausted itself and the water slowed to a trickle, there came a moment that froze everything. No talking, no movement, just the slow realization of damage. A broken roof beam, a wall that bowed like it was sighing, a fire gone out. Again, damp cloaks, shivering children, cold ashes. This was the silence of assessment, and it carried weight, emotional, practical, sometimes even fatal, because after the noise, you were left with the question, can we fix it? A collapsed roof wasn't always recoverable. A soaked grain sack meant hunger. A draft through the wrong wall corner meant your infant wouldn't survive the week. And suddenly, everything, hinged on what you had left. Who had straw? Who could lend a beam? Who had the time, strength or mercy to help? That's when silence became social. In some villages, this was the truest test of solidarity.
Neighbors emerged, blinking in the grey aftermath, and offered help, not because they liked you, but because they remembered being you, because their home was one wind gust away from the same fate. But not always. Sometimes, no one came. Sometimes the silence just grew. A woman named Hella, in a Danish parish, was known for being storm-cursed. Her roof fell 3 times in 1 year. After the third, no one helped her rebuild. Her family starved that winter. The story goes that her youngest died beneath a fallen roof while Hella searched for nails in the rain. It's not a famous tale. It didn't make the chronicles, but the silence left behind, that became legend. Peasant life was built on interdependence. Your walls weren't just yours. They were the community's to judge, support or abandon. If you fell out of favor, if you gossiped too freely, if you refused to share when others were struggling, well, let's just say people remembered. And when your roof fell, they'd remember that too. There were signs, tiny ones, that the silence was coming. Someone wouldn't return your hammer. A neighbor who once stopped to chat would glance but walk on. A loaf less frequently shared. A bucket not returned. And then the rain came. And no one knocked. It's not that peasants were cruel. It's that they were tired. Always one bad harvest. One harsh winter. One leaky ceiling away from collapse. And sometimes they chose silence as protection. An emotional daub against the storm of poverty that surrounded them all. And yet, some resisted that instinct. A young man named Osmond, from Kent, reportedly crossed 2 fields during a storm to help patch a widow's home. He carried only a bundle of straw, and a copper nail he said was lucky. When asked why he bothered, he said, because roofs fall on anyone. He died of fever a month later, but the widow told that story every winter, until her own roof fell in, and no one answered. The silence after storms wasn't just about repair, it was about memory. Who helped, who didn't, who shared, who hoarded, and more hauntingly, who was missed. Because in the end you could live with rain, with rot, with rodents and leaking stew. But silence, that was the real collapse. Smoke without fire, and the house that coughed. Here's a fun fact. Your medieval peasant house had lungs. Not in the poetic, metaphorical sense, literal lungs. And they were always congested. Let me explain. Every day, you lit a fire in the hearth. Not because you wanted to, but because you had to. For warmth, for cooking, for light, for boiling water to clean that one wooden spoon you owned. No fire meant cold porridge and frozen food. But unlike modern houses with chimneys, vents or even the courtesy of a smokeless grill, your peasant house handled smoke the same way it handled everything else: poorly. There was a hole in the roof, if you were lucky. Some homes didn't even bother with that. They just hoped the smoke would find its way out. Spoiler, it didn't. It stayed. It settled. It crawled along the ceiling beams like a ghost with bad intentions. And the result? You lived in a house that always coughed. The air stung your eyes, made your chest heavy. Your clothes smelled like you'd spent the night in a burned-out barn. Because you had. Babies were born into that air. Elders died in it. And everyone in between walked around with what medieval physicians called black lung. But what was really just 20 years of living inside a campfire. Historians still debate how peasants endured this. Some argue they grew used to it. Others believe it led to widespread respiratory issues that just didn't get recorded because, well, you were a peasant. Shortness of breath. Oh, that's just God's reminder you're still alive. They coped with it in small ways. Some built raised hearths to keep the smoke lower. Others stacked turf to reduce burn rate. A few clever souls rigged small vent holes lined with wet cloth, primitive filters that helped a bit, until it rained, and the cloth froze. One account from Bavaria mentions a woman named Agnete, who tried hanging dried lavender from her rafters to sweeten the smoke. It didn't work, but it smelled so much better that her home became the village midwife's preferred birthing hut. So there's that. But let's not sugarcoat it. Smoke was everywhere. It wasn't just in you. It was in your walls, your clothes, your food, your teeth, your soul. The house was stained with it, literally and spiritually. If your roof didn't collapse from rain, it slowly blackened and sagged from decades of soot buildup. The ceiling turned the color of despair. Your once brown beams became ghostly grey. Every cough reminded you of yesterday's fire, and the 100 before it. And when the weather turned cold, the problem only worsened. You burned wetter wood, more of it, with fewer chances to open a door or vent the space. So you huddled in your smoke warm of a house and prayed the fire stayed where it belonged, in the hearth, and didn't leap out and turn your smoky shelter into a smoky ruin. The irony, fire saved your life, but its smoke took pieces of it every day. You didn't complain. Complaining meant wasting breath, and breath was a resource in short supply. Instead, you learned to blink through the sting, to sleep with your face close to the floor where the air was thinner but slightly clear, to measure a guest's visit not by time, but by how red their eyes turned. And yes, eventually you just adapted. You grew into the house's cough, and it grew into yours, a symphony of wheezing and sizzling, of wind shrieks and throat clears. You'd never call it home, but it was yours. So you coughed, and the house coughed with you, in rhythm, because in the end it wasn't just about surviving the rain or the cold or the dark. It was about breathing, however poorly, through it all. When the walls whispered pests, prayers and paranoia, you might think a house made of sticks, dung and dreams would be too busy collapsing to do anything else. But no, sometimes, when you were alone, it talked to you. Not literally, not at first. It started with sound, the tap-tap of something in the thatch, the slow creak of a roof deciding whether or not to fail tonight, the soft, infuriating rustle of something with claws crawling behind the door, and there in the corner, scritch-scratch, always scritch-scratch, behind the same part of the wall every night. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't rain, it wasn't rain, it was alive. Now in a more modern home you'd call pest control, maybe install a camera, file a complaint with the landlord. In a medieval peasant hut, you grabbed a broom, muttered a song, and struck the wall like you were exercising it, because sometimes you were. Superstition soaked into every wattle, every mud smear. If your house groaned at the wrong hour, if something fell without a cause, if the smoke twisted in an odd shape, someone would whisper, bad spirits. You didn't have insulation, but you had folklore. Mice? Normal. Rats? Expected. But if you heard scratching without any visible cause, it might be something else. Some called it the hollow guest, a spirit that moved between homes, not to kill, but to weigh you down, to fill your nights with fear, and your sleep with dream, so vivid you'd swear they left footprints. A woman in Britain once spent 3 days tearing apart her house after a series of nightly scratching sounds. She found nothing. No rat, no nest, no thief, just a tiny carved charm wedged into the thatch. A wooden doll with no face. She moved. The new tenant lasted 1 week, but even beyond the ghost stories, the real whispering was more subtle. It was the constant reminder of your home's fragility, the way the wind curled through the gaps in the wall, like a thief with cold fingers, the way your floor shifted slightly when someone crossed it in the dark, the way your door didn't quite close, no matter how often you hammered it back into shape. Each creak was a question. How long can you last? What will break next? What haven't you noticed yet? Some peasants responded with prayer. Bits of parchment with verses were nailed over doors, crosses scratched into beams, charms hung from rafters, feathers, bones, bits of metal, anything to invite protection. Some even buried animal hearts beneath the hearth to trap evil spirits. It smelled awful, but no one cared if it kept the house quiet. Others turned to paranoia. They stopped inviting neighbors inside. They blamed livestock for creaks that clearly came. They whispered about the old gods, and poured milk at thresholds to appease the unseen. A carpenter named Willem once swore that his shed whimpered every time he tried to fix it. His neighbors laughed, until one night, he opened the door, and the entire structure fell forward like a puppet cut from its strings. The next morning, someone claimed it was punishment for patching a Christian house with pagan wood. Historians argue about these tales, of course. Most say it was simply poor construction, settling timber, or hungry vermin. But to the peasant, those whispers were real, because in a world where you understood so little, you heard everything, especially in the dark, so you lived with it. You made peace with your haunted walls. You thanked the spirits when they let you sleep. You lit a candle, even when you couldn't afford it, just to hold back the whisper for one more night. And when the house sighed with you in the wind, you whispered back, "Not tonight, please not tonight." The ceiling that wept, and the dreams that leaked through. You know the drip I'm talking about. That slow, deliberate drop of water from the sea. It starts soft, unassuming, a gentle plip into a wooden bowl, the kind of sound that on the first night makes you sigh and roll over. On the second night, you mutter. By the third, you want to set the house on fire, just to make it stop, because in a medieval peasant home, when the ceiling cried, so did you. The thatch above your head, woven bundles of straw, roots, or sometimes heather, was your only shield against the sky's tantrums. No tiles, no shingles, just nature stacked atop itself, praying not to rot. And rain was its sworn enemy, not the summer mist kind. No, the heavy, slanted, sideways rain that laughed at your roof's feeble attempts to hold itself together. The problem wasn't just that it leaked. It was where it leaked. Always over your bed, always over your stew, always, somehow, directly onto the one book your grandfather left behind. And the dripping wasn't just inconvenient, it was a symptom, because if water was coming in, it meant something had shifted, something had broken, and you wouldn't know how bad, until it was far too late. You'd climb up to patch it. Of course, you'd drag a ladder fashioned from bent wood, and sheer willpower. You'd haul straw up in a basket. You'd shove it into gaps, fingers numb, balance questionable, and it would hold for now. But that night, you'd still hear it. Not the big leak, the one, no, the new one, slightly to the left, found her, taunting. It was like a curse. Patch one leak, summon another, a game of ceiling whack-a-mole, played with your sanity. And here's the deeper cruelty. That drip came when you were trying to dream, because for the peasant, sleep wasn't escape. It was repair. It was the only time your body wasn't working. Your mind wasn't worrying. Your back wasn't bending. In your dreams, you remembered a dry sun, a feast, a joke your father once told. You remembered laughter without mud, but drip, drip, drip. It pulled you back to your cold wet mat of straw, back to the ache in your hips, back to the slow rock creeping down the post beside your head, back to the feeling that even your dreams weren't allowed to dry. One chronicler from 14th century Essex tells of a girl named Lena, who said, "The roof dreams with me." When asked what she meant, she said, "It weeps for the things I'll never have." She was 8. Her roof caved in 3 winters later. Of course, you did what you could. You moved your bed, hung cloths from the beams, caught the water in pots. Some even set out stones so the drip hit them instead of puddles. Less sound, fewer reminders. And still, it came, because the thatch was alive. It shifted, settled, a bird nested inside it, a rat chewed a hole, the wind howled, and lifted one corner, and suddenly, your whole world came through the roof instead of staying there. Some tried charm magic, braiding herbs into the thatch, carving symbols into roof poles, whistling 3 times before entering to warm the water. It didn't work, but it helped them feel less helpless. And maybe that's what all of this was. Really, a struggle, not just against the elements, but against the erosion of hope. Because when the ceiling leaks, your dreams start to leak with it. And still, somehow, you closed your eyes, because even as water tapped your brow, even as your blanket soaked slowly beneath you, even as the darkness whispered, "This is forever," you found a moment of still. A breath, a single second of peace before the next drop fell. And in that second, you survived. When your house became a sponge, there's wet, and then there's medieval peasant wet, the kind of wet that doesn't just cling to you. It claims you, the kind that seeps through the soles of your shoes, rides up your spine, like a cold whisper, and settles behind your eyes. like a sigh. You can't quite really. And the worst part, you don't even notice it anymore. Because in a medieval peasant home, everything was damp, always. Not just when it rained, not just in winter, but perpetually, habitually, philosophically damp. Your house, your beautiful ramshackle monument to survival, wasn't just a shelter. It was a sponge, soaking up every drop the sky could offer, and squeezing it slowly, maliciously, into your life. Start with the walls, the daub, still damp from last week's storm, the timber, swollen and sighing, like an old man's joints, in a thunderstorm, the straw in your mattress, clammy, your pillow, mold-kissed, even your hair, permanently coated in that delicate sheen of not quite wet, but never dry, your boots squelched indoors, your bread softened when stored in a cupboard, your cupboard softened, too, even the tools rusted before they could be, even the tools rusted before they could be used. The handle of your axe warped so badly it resembled a question mark, and when you picked up your only spoon, and noticed it had grown a little patch of green fur on the underside, you didn't scream, you scraped it clean, you kept it. He kept it, because what else were you going to do? Move, to where? Every house in the village breathed moisture. You weren't escaping it, you were just managing the symptoms. Some people tried fixes, a pot of hot coals in the corner, hanging herbs from ceiling beams, spreading sand on the floor, but all it did was mask the problem. Like dabbing perfume on a soggy rag, the damp still found you. You could smell it, that earthy, woolly, iron-rich scent. It hung in the air like gossip, never quite voiced, but always there, and it felt alive, because in the damp things grew, mildew, mysterious specks that weren't there yesterday, the occasional mushroom sprouting between the floorboards. There was even a joke: if you don't want to eat it, wait, soon it'll eat you. Your furniture softened over time. The wooden bench you sat on sagged like bread dough. The cradle squeaked ominously. Your one good barrel swelled and burst its sip, spilling precious barley water onto a floor that didn't need help being soaked. And worst of all, you got used to it. You adapted. You stopped expecting dry socks. You stopped storing anything on the ground, unless you wanted it ruined. You hung things from hooks, beams, rafters, only to find the moisture still climbed. It was relentless, intimate, a quiet violence. It got into your joints, into your lungs, into your mood.
You snapped more easily, slept less soundly. Your bones felt heavier, not from age, but from the weight of endless moisture. Historians suggest this constant dampness contributed to the peasant's famously short lifespan. Others argue it wasn't the damp, it was the despair that came with never feeling truly warm. A woman in Cornwall named Githa reportedly refused to enter her own house one spring because the walls were weeping again. She slept in the barn with the animals until someone patched her ceiling with moss and hope. The truth is, you didn't live in the damp, you lived with it, like a relative you didn't invite but couldn't evict. You stopped fighting, you started whispering bargains. Just let the bedding stay dry tonight. Please, not the grain sacks. Let me dream without coughing. Because when the rain ended, the damp remained. A reminder that survival wasn't about what you could build. It was about what you could endure. When the house around you forgot how to be dry. A roof for the dead, but not for the living. In the end, there was one shelter guaranteed to stay dry. Not your home. Not your barn. Not even the Lord's Manor with its smug stone walls and arrogant slate. No. The one structure in your village that seemed to hold firm, defy the weather, and stay perfectly, almost insultingly intact, was the church. And more specifically, the crypt. Yes, the crypt. The final stone-roofed resting place of your bones had better craftsmanship than the hut you raised your children in. It was built with care, sealed with lime mortar, and constructed by masons who actually knew what they were doing. Why? Because the dead were considered sacred, important, worth sheltering from the elements. The living, less so. You could walk into the churchyard during a storm, clothes dripping, fire out, home in ruins, and see the water bead harmlessly on the smooth stone of the chapel roof. Not a drip, not a leak, not even a draft. Inside, it was cool, dry, quiet, almost smug. Meanwhile, your roof let in rain like it had a grudge. Some peasants even took shelter in the church during heavy storms. Not because they were invited, but because it was the only building that didn't sag, sigh, or sponge up water like a guilt-soaked towel. A few huddled behind the pews, under statues of saints who stared down with cold stone indifference. They said prayers, sure, but often it was just to buy time. One record from Wiltshire tells of a man named Egrin who spent 3 consecutive nights in his village church after his home was torn open by hail. On the 3rd night, the priest found him curled beside the altar, clutching a piece of dry bread and weeping. The priest offered no sermon, just a blanket, because the truth was, everyone knew, the buildings meant for death were more reliable than those for life. Even burial was more secure. Your grave might be shallow, sure. Your coffin, if you had one, was probably stolen wood. But once the dirt was packed down and the stone set in place, the rain didn't reach you anymore. The earth swallowed the water. And you, finally, were dry. Isn't that strange? You spent your life dodging drips, your days patching holes, your nights listening to leaks. You bent yourself into strange shapes to avoid falling ceilings and rising puddles. You coughed through smoke, fungus, and winter drafts. And then, only after death, you were offered something solid. Waterproof. Weatherproof. Weatherproof. There's a cruel poetry to it. You'd visit the graves of your parents and think, they're warmer than I am. You'd eye the stone walls of the chapel, and wonder what sins you had to confess to earn a night beneath that roof. The saints got their shelter, the relics their chests, the priests their robes. You got damp socks and a roof made of straw and prayer. But still, you survived. Because while the dead had perfect roofs, they also had silence. No laughter, no stew bubbling over the fire, no dog curled at their feet, no child giggling in the corner, pointing at the new leak like it was magic. You stayed in your leaking hut, not because it was strong, but because it was yours. Because it leaked with you. Because even as the ceiling wept and the wind barged through the cracks, you sang. You loved. You endured. And in the end, the house didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to hold, long enough for you to wake up one more day. And that, it did. And now, we rest. The rain outside has softened. The fire, though faint, still whispers in the hearth, its glow casting golden halos on warped walls. The floor is still cold. The air still smells faintly of ash and damp straw. But your eyes are heavy now, heavier than the thatch above, heavier than the wooden beams creaking gently overhead. You've walked through rot, through whispers, through endless drips and coughs. You've patched walls, prayed for roofs, and listened to the wind test your patience. And still, you've made it to nightfall, dry enough, safe enough, together enough. That's what the peasants understood. Not perfection, but endurance. And in this little house of woven floors and whispered laughter, that was more than enough. So curl beneath the blanket, even if it's thin, even if it smells of smoke and wet wool, and let the night carry you. Let the rushes cradle your tired limbs. Let the roof sag and sigh above you like an old friend who stayed too long, but stayed nonetheless. The storm may come again tomorrow. The rats may resume their ballet in the walls. The ceiling may weep once more. But tonight, you've survived. And in the quiet between raindrops, you can almost hear it. The house, breathing with you. Still standing. Still sheltering. Still yours. Sleep well, little thatched world. You held.